What if I told you America's history was less a noble saga and more a fever dream in a powdered wig? Where presidents kept swearing parrots, the military trained kamikaze pigeons, and Congress flirted with returning Hawaii like a bad Amazon order. This isn't the story they teach in school. It's weirder, darker, drunker. Welcome to 101 Most Ridiculous Facts About U.S. History, a ride through the absurd, the forgotten, and the gloriously stupid moments that somehow shaped a superpower. Thomas Jefferson's skeleton fetish. Before Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States, he was many things: a philosopher, a francophile, a violinist, and, most bizarrely, a bone hoarder. Not metaphorical bones, actual bones, big ones, from extinct animals. Because when Jefferson wasn't drafting the Declaration of Independence or doubling the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase, he was writing feverishly to backwoodsmen and military officers, begging them to send him the teeth, femurs, and tusks of prehistoric beasts. Why? To prove Europe wrong. You see, the European scientific elite had a smug little theory that the Americas were biologically inferior. Their proof? American animals were too small. According to the French naturalist Buffon, everything on this side of the Atlantic was just punier. Jefferson, ever the fragile patriot, took this as a personal affront. He responded with what any rational Enlightenment thinker would: obsessive fossil hunting. In the early 1800s, Jefferson had the bones of a mastodon, a giant elephant-like creature hauled into the East Room of the White House. This wasn't a museum display. It was a statement, a flex, a prehistoric middle finger to European arrogance. Guests at the White House had to dodge femurs and molars just to get to the punch bowl. Foreign dignitaries came face to face with extinction as they tried to make small talk with the president. And this wasn't a brief phase. Jefferson was convinced that these giant creatures might still be lurking in the American wilderness. He included mastodon discovery as an informal goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Spoiler: they found grizzlies, not mammoths. Jefferson's bone obsession is often sanitized in textbooks as scientific curiosity. But let's call it what it really was: a man in power using a fossilized animal to compensate for the colonial inferiority complex of a new nation, which, to be fair, is still more productive than most midlife crises. But if you think that was the weirdest battlefield in American history, just wait until farmers took up arms against birds. The pigeon war that killed a species. America has never been particularly subtle about its conflicts, but one of the most absurd and criminally overlooked wars in its bloody scrapbook didn't involve guns, oil, or even borders. It involved birds, specifically passenger pigeons. In the 1890s, a strange and depressing chapter unfolded in the rural corners of the Midwest, the so-called Pigeon War. To understand the scale of this feathered tragedy, you have to first understand just how absurdly numerous passenger pigeons once were. They flew in flocks so dense they could block out the sun for hours. Their numbers were estimated in the billions. They were the biological equivalent of a biblical plague, except delicious, and that's where the problems began. Farmers and hunters saw these sky-darkening clouds of birds as both threat and opportunity. Crops were trampled, fields ravaged, but at the same time, meat fell from the sky. So the solution, naturally, was war. Farmers organized shooting parties. Kids were given rifles as afternoon entertainment. Entire towns participated in wholesale massacres that sometimes killed hundreds of thousands of pigeons in a single day. They called it pest control, but it was more like ecological genocide. By the time anyone realized the pigeons were disappearing for good, it was too late. The last known passenger pigeon, named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. She spent her final days alone in a cage, an ironic monument to American overkill. And yet, this episode rarely makes the textbooks. It doesn't fit neatly into the land of opportunity mythos. It's a footnote, a punchline. A reminder that America has a gift for turning abundance into absence with terrifying efficiency. But if you think bombing birds is bad, wait until the U.S. military thought nuking the moon was a perfectly reasonable idea. The plan to nuke the moon, Project A, 119. It sounds like a lost Kubrick screenplay, but no, this was real. In the late 1950s, at the peak of Cold War paranoia, the United States Air Force hatched a plan so audacious it bordered on cartoon villainy: to detonate a nuclear bomb on the surface of the moon. Not as a test, not as a defense mechanism, but as a show of power. The thinking was painfully simple in its stupidity. The Soviets had launched Sputnik, and America needed a bigger, better flex. Something dramatic, something theatrical, something you could see from Earth with the naked eye. So naturally, the idea was to lob a warhead into space and blow up a crater into American ego glory. Why the moon? Because it's up there, always watching. It seemed the perfect billboard for military virility. The theory was that a nuclear explosion on the lunar surface would create a visible mushroom cloud or flash, a celestial fireworks display of patriotic menace. America would literally light up the sky to say, "Don't mess with us." The project never went ahead, obviously. Sanity prevailed, barely. But the documents were real. The intent was real. The desperation, chillingly real. Among the scientists working on the project, a young Carl Sagan, tasked with calculating how the dust cloud would behave. Yes, the Carl Sagan, who would later advocate for peace and interstellar understanding. You have to start somewhere. That America once seriously considered nuking the moon for PR is both hilarious and horrifying. It's the kind of plot twist that makes you question how we didn't all die in the 20th century by sheer accident. And if you think that's unhinged, wait until Andrew Jackson throws open the White House doors and unleashes an apocalyptic cheese orgy. Andrew Jackson's one, 400-pound cheese apocalypse. Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory himself, was not a man known for subtlety. He dueled, he threatened secessionists, and he once beat a man nearly to death with his cane on the Senate floor. So it should surprise exactly no one that his idea of hospitality involved a 400-pound block of cheese and an open invitation to every raving lunatic within shouting distance of Pennsylvania Avenue. This was not a snack. This was not decor. This was a dairy monolith, parked in the White House foyer like a stinking symbolic middle finger to elitism. Jackson didn't just order it, he weaponized it. A gift from a New York dairy farmer, the cheese sat aging for 2 years in the White House before Jackson, in a final act of populist theater, opened the doors and said, "Come and get it." Thousands came. Not dignitaries, not staff. The people. The unwashed, undeterred, and often deeply uninvited masses. They came with knives, with plates, with fists and elbows. It was a riot disguised as a buffet. The smell reportedly lingered in the building for months. One account claimed the East Room smelled like an overripe foot. Carpets were ruined. Diplomacy was sacrificed on the altar of cheddar. But there was a twisted genius to it. Jackson was making a point. This government belongs to you, all of you, even the ones who double dip, even the ones who tracked manure in with their boots. It was messy, smelly democracy in action, a lactose-fueled populist fever dream. And if you're wondering whether this is the strangest posthumous photo op the White House has seen, well, the 1800s had a whole other hobby, photographing corpses. When the family album included the dead, the 1800s were weird. But not charming weird, or mustache and waistcoat weird. More like, let's pose for a photograph with grandma's corpse weird. In a century marked by cholera, child mortality, and unrelenting war, America developed a coping mechanism that straddled the line between sentimentality and outright horror. Post-mortem photography. At the time, photography was an emerging technology. Slow, expensive, and clunky. So when someone in the family died, especially a child, the impulse wasn't to mourn quietly. It was to prop them up, brush their hair, and immortalized the body in photographic permanence. Sometimes they were laid in coffins, sometimes seated in chairs. Eyes were painted onto eyelids. Limbs were repositioned. Occasionally, the dead looked more alive than the living relatives sitting stiffly beside them. These weren't hidden away either. They were proudly displayed, included in family albums, passed down through generations, not as a reminder of death, but of life, however brief. It sounds grotesque now, but in a time before antiseptics where grief was daily, this was the only way to hold on. These photographs were souvenirs of sorrow. It was also, in its own way, democratic. The wealthy had oil portraits of their dead. The working class had photographs. Mortality was the great equalizer, and Kodak cashed in. But let's not romanticize it too much. It was also a business. Photographers advertised in-home services for grieving families. Props and backdrops were standard. Sometimes clients couldn't afford a coffin, but they scraped together enough for one last image. One last illusion of togetherness, of control over fate. The past wasn't just darker, it was weirder. And as we'll see with America's shortest president, size really didn't matter, especially not in political myth-making. James Madison, pocket-sized power. James Madison stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed about 100 pounds soaking wet. That's not a snide remark, that's a fact. The man who fathered the Constitution could have hidden behind a podium and still had room to stretch. By modern presidential standards, Madison would barely pass as a junior senator's intern. And yet, this diminutive Virginian wielded more long-term power than most men twice his size. In politics, height has always been an unspoken factor. Tall men win debates, attract votes, fill out their suits better. Madison? He looked like a nervous clockmaker. He was soft-spoken, chronically ill, and perpetually overshadowed by louder, flashier founding fathers. Yet he outlasted most of them in influence, crafting not just the foundational texts of American government, but the tone and texture of the presidency itself. He was also, quietly, a political knife fighter. The father of the Constitution wasn't above dirty tricks. He engineered alliances, sabotaged rivals, and helped define the ever-expanding reach of federal authority. All this from a man who could have passed for a lost page boy in the Senate chambers. Historians love to wax poetic about Lincoln's towering frame or Washington's imposing stature. But Madison's legacy proves size was a distraction. The real battleground was in back rooms, draft rooms, and convention floors. And in those, Madison towered over everyone. Still, if you think a tiny man becoming a political giant is surprising, wait until you learn that Abraham Lincoln, yes, that Lincoln, used to pour drinks for a living. Lincoln the bartender. Before the stovepipe hat, before the Gettysburg Address, and long before he became a national martyr, Abraham Lincoln was a bartender. Not figuratively, not as a metaphor. He literally co-owned a saloon in Springfield, Illinois. It was called Berry and Lincoln's Tavern, and it was every bit as gritty as you'd expect from a frontier bar in the 1830s. Lincoln's partner, William F. Berry, was a drunk. A charming one, but a drunk nonetheless. That left Honest Abe to do most of the actual work, and that work included pouring whiskey, serving beer, and occasionally throwing out unruly patrons. The man who would one day free the slaves spent part of his 20s scrubbing beer-stained tables and breaking up fights between toothless farmers. It didn't last. The business failed, mostly because of Berry's drinking and poor bookkeeping. Lincoln, ever the reluctant entrepreneur, walked away saddled with debt. But the tavern left its mark. It sharpened his wit, thickened his skin, and gave him an intimate understanding of the average American's daily frustrations. Information that would prove invaluable during his presidency. It also gave us the bizarre image of Lincoln, the icon of moral fortitude, wearing an apron, cleaning mugs, and nodding sympathetically as a farmer complains about hog prices. It's almost too absurd to imagine, and yet it's real. So next time you see the Lincoln Memorial, just picture it. America's most solemn statue once handed out shots. No, but if you think stitching together a life from whiskey-soaked misfires is odd, wait until Andrew Johnson starts literally stitching his own pants. Andrew Johnson, presidential tailor. Before Andrew Johnson became president, a job he fumbled with the grace of a man slipping on a banana peel, he had a very different profession, tailoring, as in cutting fabric, hemming trousers, and sewing buttonholes. He wasn't just familiar with thread and needle, he lived by them. Born into poverty, Johnson never received formal schooling, but he did receive an apprenticeship at a tailor shop. And unlike other political figures who discarded their origins once they climbed the ladder, Johnson never really let go of his. Even as a U.S. Senator, Johnson reportedly made his own clothes. Imagine that. The man responsible for national reconstruction after the Civil War, sitting by candlelight, stitching the inseam on his own pants. It's endearing in a way, a testament to self-reliance, but it also foreshadows something else. Johnson's inability to delegate, his suspicion of elites, and his insistence on doing things his way, even when everyone else begged him not to. Tailoring is meticulous, solitary, resistant to improvisation, much like Johnson's political style. He cut Reconstruction policies like they were ill-fitting suits, stubbornly believing that his custom design would hold the country together. Spoiler, it didn't. He was the first president to be impeached, and historians frequently rank him as one of the worst to hold the office. But hey, the man could sew a hell of a jacket. Still, the image of a president hunched over a sewing machine feels quaint now, like something from a children's book. And yet, it's real. Another bizarre stitch in the American quilt. If you think Johnson's homemade wardrobe was strange, consider this. The national anthem you belt at baseball games started as a British drinking song about getting obliterated. The Star-Spangled Bar Tune. Let's get something straight. The Star-Spangled Banner is not a song you're supposed to sing sober. In fact, it was never meant to be a national anthem. It began life as a British drinking song titled To Anacreon in Heaven, written in honor of a Greek poet who celebrated wine, love, and the occasional blackout. The melody was bouncy, irregular, and complicated. Perfect for sloshed gentlemen in powdered wigs to holler at each other across pub tables. So naturally, America chose it to represent the land of the free and the home of the brave. Francis Scott Key, a lawyer and amateur poet, slapped new lyrics on this beer hall banger during the War of 1812 after witnessing the bombardment of Fort McHenry. It wasn't patriotic grandeur that inspired him. It was awe that the fort's flag was still visible after a night of explosions. But what he created was not a rousing sing-along. The song's range spans an octave and a half, making it nearly impossible to sing without either professional training or extreme confidence. Read inebriation. For decades, it was just one of many patriotic tunes Americans hummed on occasion. It wasn't until 1931, yes, 1931, that Congress made it the official anthem. And by then, its origins as a celebration of drinking culture had been conveniently forgotten. Irony abounds. A teetotaling country that banned alcohol during Prohibition adopted a bar song as its musical signature. A nation that prides itself on simplicity chose a melody designed to confuse drunk aristocrats. It's like if your LinkedIn profile started with your karaoke rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody. And if that musical whiplash isn't enough, let's talk about the time Texas ghosted the United States and became its own country. Texas, the republic that forgot to text back. Texas didn't always wear stars and stripes. For nearly a decade, it flew its own flag, collected its own taxes, and strutted around like a sovereign state because, well, it was. From 1836 to 1845, the Republic of Texas was a real thing, with a president, an army, debt problems, and the kind of swagger that only comes from overthrowing a foreign empire with a bunch of drunk volunteers. The story began with revolution. Texian settlers, many of them American expatriates, grew tired of Mexican rule and decided they'd had enough. They declared independence, fought a messy little war, and emerged victorious. Suddenly, they weren't a colony. They were a country A hot, dusty, chaotic country with more cattle than currency. Sam Houston, Texas's George Washington knockoff, led the Republic and spent most of his time trying to keep it from collapsing. Meanwhile, the U.S. wasn't sure whether to embrace this rogue cowboy cousin or keep its distance. Texas flirted with European powers, talked about annexing more territory, and even printed its own money, the Texas dollar. It was mostly worth about as much as the paper it was printed on. Eventually, the United States decided to reel Texas in, but not without controversy. The annexation in 1845 helped spark the Mexican-American War. It was a geopolitical tinderbox dressed in a 10-gallon hat. To this day, Texas maintains a weird, semi-ironic pride in its brief stint as a nation. There are bumper stickers, T-shirts, and entire high school curriculums dedicated to reminding everyone that Texas was its own country once. It's less of a history lesson and more of a personality trait. And if you think soldiers wearing magical pennies to dodge bullets is unbelievable, the Civil War had plenty more superstitions up its blood-soaked sleeves. Lincoln pennies, the Civil War's bulletproof belief. The American Civil War was many things: ideological, industrial, and indescribably brutal. But it was also superstitious. Soldiers marched into battle armed with rifles, bayonets, and something far more fragile: faith. Among Union troops, one curious charm became especially popular: the Lincoln penny. Not just carried, but deliberately altered. They'd drill holes through these small copper coins and wear them like necklaces or string them to their belts, believing they held the power to stop bullets. Now, let's pause. These were 1-cent pieces with the face of a still-living president stamped onto them. Abraham Lincoln's stoic profile, barely recognizable after a few weeks in a sweaty boot. The idea that this soft metal could stop a lead musket ball is medically laughable. But belief doesn't need science. It needs desperation. For many soldiers, the war was hell incarnate: disease, amputations, blind chaos. So if wearing Lincoln's face gave them a sliver of control over their fate, who could blame them? Lincoln, to them, wasn't just a leader. He was a living icon, almost mythic. If God had forsaken them, maybe Honest Abe could intervene. Maybe he could absorb a bullet or two. Ironically, Lincoln himself would later be shot in the head, fatally no less, rendering the entire protective talisman idea tragically moot. But the symbolism endured. Even today, finding a Civil War penny with a drilled hole is like unearthing a relic of collective psychological survival. And speaking of things that took flight for the first time, ever wonder when a president first decided to put his life in the hands of a flying machine? Hint: it was Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the middle of a war, FDR's Sky Gamble. In 1943, Franklin D. Roosevelt made history yet again. Not with a New Deal, but with a daring deal with gravity. He became the first sitting U.S. president to fly in an airplane. Now, for us, air travel is a recycled air ritual we suffer through for vacation. But in 1943, it was a high-stakes gamble with primitive engines, no Wi-Fi, and a coin-toss chance of crashing into a mountain. And Roosevelt, battling polio and the Axis powers, climbed aboard anyway. It wasn't a joyride. The stakes were deadly serious. He was en route to the Casablanca Conference to strategize with Churchill about World War II. Commercial flights were dangerous enough, but for the leader of the free world to be airborne during wartime, that was flirting with historical erasure. Roosevelt's plane was a modified military aircraft, stripped down for safety, souped up with basic comforts. He traveled with Secret Service agents, medical staff, and probably a suitcase full of cigars. The crew had to reroute constantly to avoid German U-boats and enemy radar. At any point, a misstep could have erased the Allied leadership with one crash landing. This wasn't just a first. It was a statement. A way of saying, yes, we've got this flying thing down. And yes, I'll lead from the clouds if I have to. FDR, crippled in body, but iron in spirit, stared down the odds and said, "Take off." And that flight, as ordinary as it might seem now, shattered a barrier. Presidents would no longer be tethered to trains or motorcades. Air Force One was born, Not with a roar, but with a nervous gamble at 10,000 feet. And if you thought presidential air travel was risky, wait until Boston tried to swim through molasses in what might be the stickiest disaster in American history, the Great Molasses Flood. In January 1919, Boston faced an unlikely apocalypse, not of fire or blood, but of syrup. A massive storage tank containing over 2 million gallons of molasses, unleashing a wave of sticky doom upon the city's north end. Witnesses claimed the flood 25 feet high and moved at 35 miles per hour. Imagine trying to outrun a tsunami made of pancake topping. It sounds like satire. It wasn't. The wave tore through streets, crushed buildings, and swept away people, horses, and carts. 21 people died. Another 150 were injured. Bodies were found weeks later, encased like candied relics in the dark sludge. It was, quite literally, a slow-motion tragedy. The culprit? Corporate negligence. The tank had been poorly constructed, under-inspected, and overloaded, because of course it had. The company behind it, United States Industrial Alcohol, initially blamed anarchists because scapegoating is the true American pastime. But eventually the lawsuits rained down like corn syrup in a hailstorm. The victims won a landmark legal case, and the disaster led to new safety standards for industrial construction. So yes, people had to die in caramelized agony for basic regulation to happen. The cleanup took months. The smell lingered for decades. Boston residents swore they could still catch a whiff of molasses hot days years later. It seeped into the city's soil, its psyche, and its infamy. It's a reminder that even sweetness, left unchecked, can become deadly. A literal sugar crash of catastrophic proportions. And if you think syrup behaving like a serial killer is twisted, wait until Ulysses S. Grant gets pulled over for speeding on a horse. Ulysses S. Grant, busted horseback. The idea of a sitting U.S. president getting arrested seems like the stuff of speculative fiction or a cable news fever dream. But Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general turned 18th president, holds the rare and ridiculous distinction of being the only U.S. president ever arrested while in office. His crime? Speeding. On a horse. It happened in Washington, D.C., where the cobblestone streets doubled as racetracks for the more adrenaline-addicted elite. Grant, ever the cavalryman, apparently couldn't resist the urge to reenact his Civil War charges at full gallop. Locals complained. Mothers clutched their children. And one day, a D.C. police officer named William West, an African-American veteran of the Civil War, had enough. Now, most officers might hesitate before arresting the commander-in-chief. West didn't. He stopped Grant, warned him, and let him go. The next day, Grant was out there again, reins flapping in the wind, hooves echoing off buildings. West pulled him over again, this time no warnings. He arrested the president and took him to the station. Grant reportedly accepted it with humility, even admiration for West's dedication. He paid a $20 fine. No mugshot, no trial. Just a historical footnote that remains deliciously absurd. The president who crushed the Confederacy got busted for horsing around. It's a moment that feels more like satire than fact. A reminder that even generals need to obey speed limits, especially when their vehicle is a high-strung animal with a mane. And speaking of presidential overcorrections, the next fact involves a group of well-meaning scientists in 1789 who thought the country needed a rebrand, starting with its name. The attempt to rename America Columbia. America has never been entirely comfortable with its own name. The United States of America sounds noble, sure, but also like a committee with an identity crisis. So it's not surprising that in 1789, a group of scientifically inclined intellectuals actually proposed changing the country's name to something more poetic. Columbia. Yes, Columbia. A personification of the New World, meant to evoke grandeur, nobility, and Greco-Roman vibes. It was elegant, it was aspirational. It sounded like a classical utopia, or a brand of fleece jackets. At the time, Columbia was already being used in patriotic poems, ship names, and maps. The District of Columbia? From this very impulse, The name was gaining traction, like a hashtag that never quite caught on. The proponents believed Columbia had more cultural gravity. United States felt administrative, like a spreadsheet. Columbia, on the other hand, conjured an image, a goddess draped stars and stripes, nobly watching over amber waves of grain. It was nationalism with an artistic soul. But the name never took. Why? Because the founders were, above all, compromise addicts. United States was bland, but functional. Emphasized unity over identity. Columbia felt too poetic, too mythical, too French. And so it remained relegated to songs, monuments, and that awkward college in New York. The name that almost was haunts the margins of American iconography. You see her in statues, in old stamps, in the cinematic intro of Columbia Pictures. A ghost of an America that wanted to sound more like an empire and less like a bureaucratic accident. Still, it raises the question, what does the name matter when your birth certificate is already forged in revolution? And on that note, let's talk about one of the biggest historical lies Americans still believe. What really happened on July 4th, 1776. The Declaration's delayed delivery. Every school child in the United States is taught that the nation was born on July 4th, 1776. Fireworks, hot dogs, bald eagles, the whole patriotic fever dream. The truth is a little less cinematic. The Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 4th. Most delegates didn't touch pen to parchment until August 2nd. So what happened on July 4th? That's the day the Continental Congress officially adopted text. It's like signing a lease verbally on the phone and then forgetting to fax the paperwork until 3 weeks later. The drama of independence had already been brewing. Congress had voted in favor of separation from Britain on July 2nd. John Adams even predicted that date would be remembered and celebrated. Poor guy. Off by 2 days, and history never let him live it down. Why the delay? Bureaucracy, printing, travel? Not every delegate was in Philadelphia at the time. Some were sick, some were late, some were deliberately dragging their feet. Signing a document declaring treason against the world's largest empire was not exactly an easy RSVP. The image of all those founding fathers solemnly gathered around a document on a hot July day? Pure myth, a staged reimagining. The final signatures trickled in over weeks and months. The unity we're sold was more like a hesitant group project. And yet, July 4th stuck. It had good timing, better PR, and fewer logistical complications than trying to rebrand August as the new patriotic month. So we celebrate a date for its symbolism, not its truth. Which, as you'll see next, is a recurring theme in American history, especially when the government started poisoning people on purpose. Prohibition's poisoned legacy. When the U.S. government banned alcohol in the 1920s, it wasn't just about morality or public health. It was about control. And when the country's citizens refused to give up their beloved booze, Washington took a dark and deeply ironic turn. It started poisoning the supply. Yes, on purpose. Welcome to one of the chilling and absurd moral paradoxes in American history. The noble cause of prohibition quickly descended into a cat-and-mouse game between federal agents and bootleggers. But while speakeasies thrived and bathtub gin flowed like jazz-age holy water, the government realized it needed a new deterrent. Fear. Industrial alcohol, used in manufacturing, cleaning, and chemical production, was being hijacked and redistilled for illegal drinking. So in an effort to curb this, the Treasury Department ordered manufacturers to denature it by adding deadly chemicals like methanol, formaldehyde, and even gasoline. The message was clear. If you drink this, you might die. Your call. And people did die. By the thousands. Estimates suggest over 10,000 Americans were poisoned during Prohibition by tainted alcohol. The government knew. They didn't stop. The idea was that the risk would scare people straight. Instead, it just made the streets more dangerous and the federal government morally complicit in mass homicide. Of course, officials cloaked it in utilitarian language. It was for the greater good, a necessary evil. But try telling that to the grieving families of those who dropped dead at a holiday party because their punch bowl was spiked with toxic chemistry. It's the kind of government policy that, in hindsight, feels more like dystopian satire. A crusade for health that weaponized chemistry against its own citizens. And if you think horrifying, just wait until we get to the time Teddy Roosevelt got shot mid-speech and kept talking anyway. Teddy Roosevelt takes a bullet and keeps talking. It's the kind of moment that would get cut from a movie for being too unrealistic. October 14, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Theodore Roosevelt, the former president and then Bull Moose candidate, steps out to give a campaign speech and is promptly shot in the chest. The bullet passed through his overcoat, a steel eyeglass case, a folded 50-page speech, and into his rib cage. Blood soaked his shirt. A lesser man would have collapsed. A smarter would have gone to the hospital, but was neither of those things. He was a Roosevelt. He stood up, waved off the crowd, and insisted on delivering the speech anyway. For 90 minutes, the bullet still lodged in his body. He roared about American nationalism, third-party politics, and reform. At one point, he even announced, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The audience, naturally, lost their minds. Doctors later determined the bullet had missed his lungs and wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it could have been. Roosevelt's reckless bravado wasn't just political theater. It was a deeply embedded belief that the presidency was a proving ground for masculine endurance. Pain was irrelevant. Death was negotiable. Pride was sacred. He survived. The bullet stayed in his body for the rest of his life, like a permanent punctuation mark to that day's speech. A metallic reminder that Roosevelt didn't just talk tough, he bled tough. And if training dolphins for war sounds far-fetched, just remember, America didn't just survive on bravado. Sometimes it weaponized nature itself. The dolphins of war. In the realm of military absurdity, few projects are as surreal or as genuinely unsettling as the U.S. Navy's decision to train dolphins for combat. These weren't circus performers or aquarium stars. They were enlisted operatives trained to detect underwater mines, locate lost swimmers, and in some classified reports, neutralize enemy divers. The logic made twisted sense. Dolphins are fast, agile, and incredibly intelligent. They can navigate dark waters with echolocation. So the Pentagon asked, why not use them as sonar-equipped torpedoes with flippers? Beginning during the Cold War, the Navy developed programs that turned marine mammals into strategic assets. Dolphins were taught to drop markers, carry cameras, and even attach explosive devices to enemy vessels. The ethical gray zone was ignored in favor of patriotic utility. After all, what's more American than outsourcing war to an animal that always looks like it's smiling? They even had ranks, handlers, and military IDs. Some were deployed in real missions, including harbor defense and recovery operations. The line between Marine Biology 101 and Dr. Strangelove Goes to Sea blurred completely. The dolphins didn't get medals or choice, but they swam their missions anyway. Biological tools in a geopolitical chess match. It's easy to laugh until you remember, this wasn't satire. It happened. And it didn't end there. The U.S. would later escalate this tradition of ridiculous conflict even further, with a war over a single pig, the pig that nearly saw war. In 1859, the United States and Britain stood on the brink of war, not over borders or ideology, but over bacon. Specifically, a pig. An ill-fated hog that rooted around the wrong patch of potatoes on San Juan Island, a misty speck of land between Vancouver Island and the coast of Washington state. The pig belonged to an Irishman under British protection. The potatoes, claimed by an American settler named Lyman Cutler. You can see where this is going. Cutler shot the... Tensions escalated with the speed of absurdity. British authorities threatened to arrest him. Settlers screamed about sovereignty, and in no time both countries began amassing troops on the island. Yes, troops. cannons were hauled ashore. Warships circled, all because of one pig's poor impulse control. This incident became known, appropriately, as the Pig War, except no actual war happened. Cooler heads, and probably confused ones, prevailed. Military commanders from both sides stalled, refusing to fire the first shot. Negotiations dragged on for months while soldiers on both sides camped out in awkward proximity, sharing supplies, trading jokes, and growing increasingly embarrassed. Eventually, both nations agreed to a joint occupation of the island, a compromise that lasted for over a decade. The was finally resolved through arbitration in 1872 by the German Emperor of all people. He awarded it to the United States. As for the pig, dead, forgotten, except by history nerds with a taste for irony. It's a perfect metaphor for American diplomacy at the time. Territorial, impulsive, and oddly theatrical. Yet, somehow no shots were fired. The pig remains the only casualty, a porcine martyr to bureaucratic absurdity. And speaking of origin stories, let's shift from animal-instigated warfare to a presidential trivia tidbit that's oddly easy to forget. Who was the first president born after the United States actually existed? Martin Van Buren, America's first native-born president. Martin Van Buren doesn't usually make the presidential highlight reel. He's remembered vaguely as a guy with mutton chops and a forgettable term, somewhere between Andrew Jackson's fist-fighting legacy and the national existential crisis of the Civil War. But Van Buren holds one genuinely unique title. He was the first president born a citizen of the United States. Everyone before him, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, and Jackson, were born as British. They were colonial-born Americans. Van Buren, born in 1782 after the Declaration of Independence, and therefore the first president who didn't grow up pledging allegiance to a king. This may sound a boring technicality, but it marked a seismic shift. Van Buren wasn't a Revolutionary War relic. He was part of the next wave, men shaped by the idea of America, not just its rebellion. His reflected that. Dutch-speaking, lawyer by trade, savvy political operator. He understood parties, coalitions, and public perception better than most of his predecessors. In fact, he was one of the key architects of the Democratic Party as a political machine. He also had a taste for luxurious living, was known for his impeccable fashion sense, and had a knack for alienating people. His presidency was marred by economic depression, making him an easy target for populist anger. Still, the symbolism of his birth mattered. He was the first of a new kind of American leader, not a revolutionary hero, but a native-born administrator of the Republic. His legacy is mostly forgotten, eclipsed by louder, bloodier, or taller presidents. But in the timeline of American identity, Van Buren represents the awkward adolescence of a nation trying to govern itself with rules it barely understood. Now imagine if someone had handed that confused young 1.7 million maps. That's what the Library of Congress did, mapping America's obsession. The Library of Congress isn't just the world's largest library. It's America's collective memory, where the nation stores everything from presidential love letters to obscure patents involving exploding rats. But one of its most curious and criminally underappreciated collections is its archive of over 1.7 million of them, some dating back to the 1300s, long before anyone in Europe knew where the hell America was. Maps are more than just directional tools. They're cultural declarations, political propaganda, and philosophical Rorschach, and the library's collection contains all of it. There are maps drawn by conquistadors imagining cities of gold, maps with sea monsters frolicking in the Atlantic, Civil War battlefield layouts, cadastral diagrams of colonial farmland, even moon landing routes. If America once dreamed it, feared it, or tried to own it, there's a map for that. These aren't just historical artifacts. They're evidence of how America saw itself and how it wanted to be seen. Some maps expand territory that hadn't been conquered yet. Others conveniently omit inconvenient people, like Native American tribes, It's cartography as ideology, as fantasy, as wishful thinking wrapped in parchment and ink. And the sheer volume of it, 1.7 million, is absurd. It's as if every shift in the national mood required another updated diagram. We now own this river. That mountain has gold. Ignore the massacre. Look at the border, a paper trail of conquest, migration, paranoia, and pride. Walking through that archive is like eavesdropping on history's inner monologue. Conflicted, confident, utterly self-important. And next, we're going to examine another peculiar American chant. One that began not with a president or a general, but with a socialist minister and an awkward classroom exercise. The birth of Pledge of Allegiance. The socialist behind the pledge. The Pledge of Allegiance, today a rote sing-songy incantation muttered every morning by millions of bleary-eyed schoolchildren, was originally not by a founding father, military general, or patriotic bureaucrat, but by a Christian socialist minister named Francis Bellamy. That's right. The Daily American Loyalty Oath was written by a man who Jesus would have been a Marxist. It was 1892. Bellamy was tasked with crafting something stirring and unifying for the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, a celebration steeped in nationalism myth. What he wrote was deceptively simple. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Short, rhythmic, and vaguely hypnotic. Notice what's missing? Under God. That added until 1954, during the Cold War paranoia peak, when the Eisenhower administration to remind the Soviets America had divine backing. Bellamy, who supported the separation of church and state, would have hated that edit. Ironically, Bellamy's vision of America was one of economic justice, racial equality, and cooperative labor, none of which comfortably align with the flag-waving capitalism the pledge now represents. The original pledge was meant to foster civic unity, not blind obedience. And the original salute that accompanied it? A stiff-arm gesture that unfortunately looked exactly like the Nazi salute. That was quietly changed during World War II. Today, the pledge is both sacred and controversial. A daily ritual that's become invisible through repetition, its radical origins forgotten or sanitized. Bellamy's version was a poetic appeal to shared ideals. The modern one is a litmus test. Next time you hear it, imagine its author, a socialist preacher, watching as kids recite his words beneath a flag that now sells more t-shirts than truths. And speaking of poetic exits, let's jump to one of the most eerie coincidences in presidential history. Two founding fathers, one shared death date. Death on 4th of July. If you ever needed proof that the universe has a twisted sense of timing, consider this. Both John Adams and Jefferson, founding fathers, revolutionary turned bitter rivals and eventual pen pals, died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826. Not just any day, the 50th anniversary of independence they helped create. Let that in. Two architects of American liberty, men who hadn't spoken for years after political fallout, spent their twilight years rekindling their friendship through deeply philosophical letters. And then, poof, gone on the nation's golden birthday. It's poetic, suspicious, almost too perfectly scripted. If a screenwriter penned it, you'd call it cheesy. But history, as usual, doesn't care about believability. Adams was 90, was 83. They died hours apart, unaware of the other's passing. Adams's last words were allegedly, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died earlier that morning at Monticello, his body failing, but his pride. Both men had lived long enough to see their revolution calcify into governance, their ideals tested, and their nation expand beyond anything they'd imagined. Their deaths became instant mythology. Newspapers seized on the coincidence like prophecy fulfilled. It was God's signature, some claimed. Destiny's final flourish. Of course, historians with a more cynical bent see it as a grimly convenient alignment of biology and symbolism. But the most hard-nosed skeptic has to admit it's a hell of a curtain call. And if you thought America peaked in 1826, wait until you find out it tried to buy Greenland. More than once. Greenland, America's icy daydream. Manifest Destiny had a cold weather fetish, it would be Greenland. Believe it or not, the U.S. has tried to buy it. Not once, not twice, but at least 3 times in 1867, 1946, and again in 2019. It's like a toxic ex who keeps texting you up across centuries. The first attempt, shortly after the Civil War, was part of America's shopping spree under Secretary of State William Seward. Yes, the guy who Alaska. He had big frozen dreams. The second try came post-World War II, when strategic military positioning made Greenland's icy real estate look prime. The third? Well, that one involved a real estate mogul turned president who floated the idea like it was just another casino investment. Each time Denmark, Greenland's reluctant landlord, politely declined. And each time Americans reacted with a mixture of baffled nationalism and disbelief. Why Greenland? Because under all that ice sits valuable land, rare earth minerals, and juicy military logistics. Plus, the melting Arctic means it might someday become usable, or at least less useless. But Greenland is not for sale. It's home to 56,000 people who don't particularly want to be annexed. The idea that the U.S. could just slap a price tag on someone else's homeland and call it a deal speaks volumes about its foreign policy instincts. Assume everything's for sale if your wallet's fat enough. Yet, the dream persists. Greenland remains the cold, quiet object of American desire, a blank slate for projection, fantasy, and geopolitical thirst. Next, let's rewind to a time before modern sanitation, when Americans used creative methods to keep themselves clean. Starting with corn cobs. Yes, corn cobs. Before toilet paper, the Corn Chronicles. Modern Americans may take their triple-ply, lavender-scented toilet paper for granted, but for most of the country's early history, hygiene in the privy was a matter of improvisation. Before the dawn of commercially produced toilet in the mid-19th century, Americans wiped with whatever was nearby, absorbent and disposable. Among the most popular choices, corn cobs. Yes, actual dried corn cobs, those rustic ribbed leftovers of the American harvest, were repurposed into rudimentary hygiene tools. And not ironically, not out of desperation, with horrifying sincerity. They were cheap, plentiful, and surprisingly effective, depending on your definition of comfort. And in rural areas, where practicality trumped luxury, it was just what you did. The Sears catalog would later become the gold standard. Pages torn out for use in outhouses across the country. But before that, it was nature's own scratchy scepter. It gets worse. Leaves, hay, moss, wool scraps, even oyster shells found their way into the American bathroom. And this wasn't some centuries-old horror story. It persisted into the early 20th century in many rural parts of the country. There was no universal upgrade. Modern sanitation was a slow, uneven revolution. So today's toilet paper aisle inspires existential dread during shortages. Remember that not long ago your ancestors were reaching for agricultural byproducts and smiling, but you can argue this says something poetic about American resilience, or something deeply unsettling about our standards. Speaking of vintage self-portraits, let's turn to the ghostly figure who accidentally invented the American selfie before Instagram or electricity existed. The first American selfie. Long before filters and front-facing cameras, there was Robert Cornelius, a man with a fondness for chemistry, silver plates, and unflinching stillness. In 1839, Cornelius, a Philadelphia-based amateur photographer and lamp maker, snapped what is widely believed to be the first self-portrait in American history. In other words, the original selfie. It was a hazy, ghost-like image. His expression was somber, as if he knew that future generations would eventually be duck-facing their way into oblivion. But make no mistake, this was a moment of innovation, not vanity. Photography was in its infancy. The daguerreotype process required long exposure times and precarious chemical balancing. Cornelius had to remove the lens cap, sit perfectly still several minutes, and then replace the cap, without smudging the plate or spontaneously combusting. The result? a hauntingly intimate capture of a man staring into history before it knew what to do with him. He didn't smile. No one did back then. Smiling was for drunks and madmen. But Cornelius's gaze is steady, almost defiant, as if daring the viewer to interpret meaning in the shadows behind him. That one image, a technical experiment and accidental art piece, has since become a cornerstone of photographic lore. He didn't patent the process. He didn't start a company. He simply wanted to see if it could be done. And it could. And it was. It's easy to overlook this relic, but it's proof that even before we knew the word content, Americans were already obsessed capturing themselves in frozen time. Next, let's travel to 1846, where the sound of leather on willow cracked for the first time in a Hoboken field, and the great American pastime began in a muddy New Jersey park. The birth of baseball in Hoboken. Baseball, America's favorite metaphor for everything from politics to poetry, wasn't born in a gleaming stadium or codified by a sacred text. It began on a flat patch of grass in Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1846. No lights, no nachos, no screaming fans. Just a group of amateur gentlemen with questionable uniforms and a borrowed bat. That first recorded game was played between the Knickerbocker Club and the New York Nine. The Knickerbockers, led by Alexander Cartwright, had recently drafted a set of rules that resembled modern baseball more than the chaotic stick-and-ball games previously imported from Europe. 9 innings, 3 outs per side. No beaning runners to get them out. Revolutionary stuff. The New York Nine absolutely crushed the Knickerbockers, by the way. It wasn't a nail-biter, but the point wasn't winning. It was standardization. It was making a game into a ritual. Baseball wasn't just sport. It was order in a chaotic republic, leisure wrapped in structure, democracy with a box score. From that muddy, windswept field, baseball spread like a prairie fire. Soldiers played it during the Civil War. Towns built fields. Kids used broomsticks and bottle caps. By the late 19th century, it was being called the national pastime, even though most Americans couldn't afford the time or the tickets. That Hoboken game wasn't televised, recorded, or even particularly well attended, but it was the big bang of American sports culture. Everything from the World Series to League to baseball metaphors and political speeches traces back to that oddly named club on a New Jersey lawn. And if that isn't surreal enough, just until the Cold War era, when the U.S. government quietly drew up top-secret blueprints for the moon, mapping the moon for the end of the world. In the feverish twilight of the Cold War, America wasn't just preparing to fight wars on Earth. It was quietly drafting war plans for space. Among the more bizarre artifacts of that era was a classified initiative in which the U.S. government developed detailed maps of the moon. Not for exploration, not for science, but for strategic purposes in the event of nuclear apocalypse. You heard that right. As part of a contingency plan for global annihilation, American intelligence and military agencies started charting the lunar with meticulous care. These weren't whimsical star charts or NASA navigation aids. These were potential survival blueprints, geopolitical chessboards in orbit. If Earth went up in radioactive flames, the moon might serve as a fallback, a last resort platform, or at least a symbolic high ground in the scorched remnants of civilization. Why the moon? Because whoever controlled the highest ground had the last advantage. The logic was insane, but so was the time. These maps showed impact zones, contours, potential landing sites. They were often drafted with spy-level secrecy, stored in bunkers alongside plans for continuity of government and deep Earth bunkers. They were part of a larger vision, call it lunacy or lunar ambition, that included Project Horizon, a plan for a U.S. Army base on the moon, and other unhinged proposals to assert dominance in the final frontier. In retrospect, the whole thing reads like sci-fi fan fiction written by paranoid bureaucrats. But it was real, tangible, funded, mapped. The moon wasn't a romantic symbol in this version of history. It was a hypothetical bunker. And as wild as that is, it's still not as gold-crazed as the next chapter in America's story, a time when you could pay for dinner with literal flakes of fortune. The gold dust economy. The California gold wasn't just a fever dream. It was a full-blown delusion turned economy. In 1848, James Marshall struck gold at Sutter's Mill, and within thousands of would-be millionaires swarmed west like locusts with pickaxes. Towns popped up overnight. Laws vanished. Fortunes were made, stolen, and lost faster than a coin toss. And in the middle of it all, currency got weird. Gold dust, fine, flaky, impossible to measure gold dust, became the de facto medium of exchange. It was everywhere, in boots, in beards, in bootleg saloons. Merchants accepted it for goods and services, weighing it out with scales, spoons, and questionable math. You'd pay for coffee by the pinch, a hotel room by the thimbleful. No one really knew the exact value, but no one cared either. Gold was gold, and paranoia was part of This created chaos. Dishonest dealers salted their scales. Dust was cut with sand or iron pyrite. Fights broke out over mismeasurements, but no one wanted to stop, because it was the American dream in raw powdered form. You didn't need a bank account. You didn't even need shoes. Just gold, and a place to spend it. Eventually, the U.S. Mint established branches in San Francisco to tame the anarchy with real coinage. But for years, the gold economy functioned like a fevered barter system, shimmering, uncertain, and always on the verge of collapse. And speaking of linguistic relics from chaotic times, our next tale rewinds to the origins of one of the strangest political words in the American lexicon. It's not piracy, but it's pretty close. The pirate politics of filibuster. Today, filibuster conjures images of gray-haired senators droning for hours in wood-paneled rooms draped in procedural boredom. But the word itself, it has swashbuckling origins. Filibuster comes from the Dutch word vrijbuiter, meaning pirate or freebooter. And that etymology, more than poetic, it's eerily accurate. In the 19th century, American adventurers known as filibusters, yes, that was their title, launched unsanctioned military expeditions into Latin American countries. Their goal? Conquer territory, install friendly regimes, and maybe carve out a kingdom or two. All unofficially, of course. These weren't diplomats. They were guns for hire, driven by manifest destiny and ego. William Walker, one of the most infamous filibusters, actually seized control of Nicaragua for a year, declared himself president, reinstated slavery, and was eventually executed by firing squad. America was conflicted. As their political equivalents emerged in Congress, obstructing legislation with never-ending speeches and procedural sabotage, the filibuster stuck. It fit. These were legislative pirates, hijacking the ship of state, not with cannons, but with clauses. The Senate embraced the tactic, for better or worse. It became a tool for both standstills and grotesque delays. Civil rights bills were filibustered. So were tax reforms and healthcare expansions. Sometimes it preserved liberty. Often it just preserved inertia. So the next time you hear a senator rambling endlessly on C-SPAN, don't just see a policy nerd in a tie. Picture a political pirate looting the clock for personal or partisan gain. And if that sounds oddly familiar, wait until you hear how long it took Congress to admit the national anthem was just an old drinking song, belting the booze anthem. The time Congress officially recognized the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem in 1931, the song had already been circulating for over a century, first in bars, then in ballparks, and eventually in battlefields. It had quite literally sobered up from its original identity, a boozy British drinking song. The melody now stirs patriotic tears at sporting events, began its life as the theme for a gentleman's club that sang odes to wine, women, and euphoric disarray. Francis Scott Key's lyrics, penned in 1814 during the War of 1812 after witnessing the bombardment of Fort McHenry, were stapled onto the already popular tune, To Anacreon in Heaven. It was the musical equivalent of printing a national motto on a beer label. But the imagery of bombs and an unyielding flag caught on. Over the decades, it became the de facto patriotic chant, even if it was notoriously difficult to sing and vaguely incoherent by the third verse. Still, it wasn't. Presidents came and went. Wars were fought. Flags were waved. But Congress refused to make it law. The hesitation about the song's origins so much as its competition. Other contenders like America the Beautiful, My Country, 'Tis of Thee, were considered more melodic, less martial, and frankly easier on the vocal cords. But none carried the same mythic baggage as Key's anthem. In 1931, during the Great Depression, Congress finally caved. Maybe the country needed something bold and explosive. Maybe it just needed a reminder that survival looked like a flag still visible through smoke. But make no mistake, it wasn't chosen for its musicality. It was chosen because it sounded like America, loud, dramatic, slightly off-key, and suspiciously familiar from a bar fight. And while we're on presidents' unusual hobbies, let's talk about Nixon, who funded his rise to power not through politics, but through poker. Nixon's poker face. Before he was president, before Watergate, and long before he mumbled his resignation into national shame, Richard Nixon was a Navy officer stationed in the Pacific during War II, and a ruthless poker player. Not just competent, deadly. Nixon had a face like a chalkboard and the psychological intuition of a street hustler. He played for keeps, reading opponents like briefing memos and bluffing them into submission. Within a year, he raked in thousands, reportedly enough to fund his first congressional campaign when he returned stateside. That's right, Nixon gambled his way into politics. There's poetic symmetry here. The man who would later become synonymous with paranoia, subterfuge, and political double-dealing got his start reading tells and manipulating odds. His poker nights weren't about fun. They were strategic simulations, ideological war games with the cards. And he was good. Officers would come to the table cocky, leave broke, and confused. Nixon wasn't flashy, but he was consistent, silent, watching, waiting for an opening. His win rate wasn't a fluke. It was calculation. This wasn't luck. It was Nixon being Nixon. He rarely spoke of it publicly. Presidents aren't supposed to be gamblers. But those who served with him knew. They remembered. And it left an impression. One biographer even called it his first campaign, a dry run for the control, deception, and strategy he would carry into public life. So while the Watergate tapes would later expose a man unraveling behind the curtain, the poker table showed us the version of Nixon he always wanted to be, in control, one step ahead, and cashing in when no one else even knew he was playing. And if you think Nixon's bluffing was wild, wait until you hear about the U.S. sending an iceberg negotiator to Denmark. Yes, ICE, as a diplomatic tool, America's iceberg ambassador. In 1946, America sent an envoy to Denmark. But this wasn't just any ambassador. This one came with a surreal agenda to negotiate the purchase of Greenland. Again, only this time the strategy came bundled in cold melting symbolism, an actual iceberg ambassador. Okay, not literally a chunk of ice in a tuxedo, but the diplomatic overture was dressed in enough Arctic drama to feel like a climate-themed spy movie. The U.S. had developed a geopolitical crush on Greenland, driven by military logistics and future strategic advantages. The Cold War had just begun, and the top of the world was suddenly prime real estate. To sweeten the deal, the U.S. attempted a charm offensive involving economic aid, friendly visits, and subtle power plays. Among them, a stunt involving a massive towed iceberg to symbolize mutual Arctic interests. It was part diplomacy, part theater, and all deeply American in its absurdity. Denmark, polite as ever, declined. Again. The U.S. got military access, but not. Greenland remained a stubborn crush America couldn't quite quit. But the iceberg ambassador remains a chilling metaphor, pun intended, for how far the U.S. was willing to go to claim what it believed was inevitably its own. Because if there's one thing that drives American diplomacy, It's the belief that geography is just an obstacle to be reasoned with, purchased, or melted down. And if you think that's absurd, let's switch from frozen islands to fiery war, and the Nobel Prize that somehow came out of it, via a president who loved shooting things almost as much as he loved peace. Teddy Roosevelt, for peace. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." But history made sure to add a footnote and then win a Nobel Peace Prize. In 1906, Roosevelt became the first American, not just the first president, the first American, to receive a Nobel Prize. And for literature, conservation, or his legendary bear-related branding. No, Roosevelt won the world's most prestigious peace award for ending a war, specifically the Russo-Japanese War, a brutal conflict over territory, ego, and imperial ambition in East Asia. The fighting was fierce, stakes global, and into this chaotic arena stepped Roosevelt, a man who had previously charged up San Juan Hill yelling about manhood and destiny. Somehow he became the diplomatic bridge between two empires. He invited Russian and Japanese representatives to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, of all places, and brokered a treaty. It wasn't a perfect peace. Both sides left unsatisfied, which, Roosevelt argued, meant he did it right. What mattered to him and to the Nobel Committee was that he'd used American influence to cool down a global powder keg. It marked the U.S.'s coming-of-age moment on the stage. No longer just a backwater republic with big dreams. America was now a mediator, a referee in the imperial ring. The irony? Roosevelt didn't love peace. He adored war. He romanticized it. He believed it forged character and national greatness. But he also believed in managing violence, in channeling chaos. He knew that power was only respectable if it could de-escalate as well as destroy. So yes, the man who collected pelts, boxed in the White House, and survived an assassination attempt mid-speech also collected a peace medal. And maybe that contradiction is exactly what made it believable. Speaking of presidents with strange oral histories, let's chew on the myth of George Washington's wooden teeth. Washington's dental horror show. Everyone knows the legend. George Washington had teeth. It's become a quaint anecdote, trotted out in classrooms to humanize the stony-faced founder. But like most charming myths, it's almost entirely false, and way more disturbing in reality. Washington did have dentures, several sets in fact. But none were made of wood. Instead, they were crafted from an unsettling combination of ivory, brass, gold, animal bone, and, most shockingly, human teeth. Some of those teeth came from enslaved people. Yes, the father of the nation likely walked with someone else's teeth in his mouth. People who had no freedom, no agency, and certainly no in the matter. These weren't noble heirlooms passed down voluntarily. They were bodily commodities, part of a grotesque dental economy tied to slavery and status. Washington's dental woes were legendary. By the time he took office, he had one lonely tooth left. His dentures were awkward, painful, and ill-fitting, often distorting his speech. Artists had to alter his portraits to compensate for his puffy jawline. Behind the marble busts and solemn statues was a man constantly suffering, grinding through pain to maintain presidential dignity. The wooden teeth myth likely emerged because the stained ivory gave his dentures a grainy appearance. Wood was an easier, more palatable lie. It made Washington seem rustic, relatable, even eco-friendly by accident. But the truth is messier, much messier. His smile, what little of it there was forged from exploitation and desperation, which feels, in some ways, eerily symbolic of the era. Next, from recycled teeth to recycled air. Let's take a pneumatic journey through America's oddest postal delivery experiment, when letters were shot through like bank receipts in a nationwide science fair gone wrong. Pneumatic mail and the air-powered dream. Before emails, before airmail, before even reliable trucks, America briefly flirted with an idea so steampunk it feels like a Jules Verne fever dream. Pneumatic mail tubes. Yes, pressurized cylinders launching letters through underground tunnels at dizzying speeds. Think of it as FedEx by way of a science fair. In the early 20th century, major cities like New York and Boston installed networks of these tubes beneath the streets. Mail would be stuffed into canisters, then fired through pressurized systems from one postal facility to another. It was fast, futuristic, and incredibly loud. Postal workers described the sound like a hurricane through a brass trumpet. It was also unpredictable. Occasionally, tubes would clog, canisters would rupture, or letters would arrive looking like they'd survived trench warfare. But when it worked, it was magical. Letters could fly across Manhattan in minutes. It felt like living inside the future. For a brief, glorious window, pneumatic mail seemed poised to revolutionize communication. So why didn't it last? 2 words: maintenance and scale. The system was expensive, prone to breakdowns, and limited in reach. As cities grew, it became clear that a network of pressurized pipes under every street wasn't just impractical, it was madness. Trucks took over, planes followed, and the tubes? Abandoned, sealed, forgotten, except in certain corners of old post offices where rusted pipe sections remained like relics of a lost sci-fi civilization. Reminders that America has always dreamed big, even when the dream involved shooting your mail through plumbing. And next, if you thought steel tubes filled with mail were dangerous, wait until the British showed up to light the White House on fire, and succeeded. When the British burned the White House in the War of 1812, a conflict that even many Americans struggle to remember why it started, Britain gave the fledgling United States a harsh reminder that because you declare independence doesn't mean you're done fighting. And in 1814, they drove that point home by storming the Capitol and burning down the White House. Yes, the White House, the actual residence of the president. They set it on fire like it was a rebel outpost in a video game. It wasn't random arson. It was payback. Earlier that year, American troops had burned government buildings in York, now Toronto, and the British were all happy to return the favor with terrifying flair. As the British approached Washington, D.C., President James Madison and his wife Dolly fled, taking with them, famously, a portrait of George Washington. It was a dramatic moment. Dolly didn't just grab her handbag and leave. She ordered the massive painting to be cut from its frame so it wouldn't be taken or defiled by invading troops. Imagine escaping an invading army with a presidential oil painting in tow. Iconic. The British torched not only the White House, but also the Capitol building and other government structures. The flames lit up the night sky like some kind of dystopian fireworks display. It was both and literal, burning the heart of American government to ash. The White House was gutted. Its charred walls stood as a scorched reminder of vulnerability and vengeance. When Madison returned, the devastation was profound. And yet, the government persisted. America rebuilt, repainting its shame and moving forward as if nothing had happened. Because in American history, denial is often a survival tactic. And speaking of speed and tragedy, the next flashes through the record books in just 32 days, the shortest presidency in U.S. history. William Henry Harrison's 32-day death march. When William Henry Harrison won the 1840 election, he did so as a war hero, a log cabin myth, and the embodiment of rugged populism. His campaign was full of hard cider, catchy slogans, and frontier cosplay. But his presidency? It barely registered as a blip on the timeline. Harrison's the dubious honor of having the shortest presidency in American history, just 32 days. It began with a speech, a really long one. On March 4, 1841, Harrison delivered his inaugural address, an epic, nearly 2-hour monologue in the freezing rain without a hat or coat, because nothing screams presidential strength like public hypothermia. He was 68 at the time, which in 19th century years was roughly equivalent to being 112. Shortly afterward, he caught a cold. The cold turned into pneumonia. The pneumonia turned into a national crisis. And before anyone had time to issue an executive order, Harrison was dead. The country was stunned. This was uncharted territory. No president had ever died in office before. What now? Who takes over? Enter John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, who promptly set the precedent that the VP doesn't just act as president, he becomes president. A constitutional gray area was solved with a funeral and a power grab. Harrison's legacy is mostly a trivia fact now, a presidential cameo. His death was used as a cautionary tale against long speeches, old candidates, and ignoring the weather forecast. But in those 32 days, he managed to rewrite the rule book simply by dying at the worst possible time. Now, from brief presidencies to underwhelming grades, the story features a teenager who designed the modern U.S. flag and got a B- for it. The flag that got a B. In 1958, Robert G. Heft was a 17-year-old high school student in Ohio with a penchant for civics and a mildly obsessive streak. As part of a history project, his teacher asked the class to design a new U.S. flag. Alaska had just been admitted to the Union, and the of Hawaii joining was looming. The current 48-star flag was soon to be outdated. So Heft sat down, calculated the most aesthetically balanced layout, and stitched together a star version. 5 rows of 6 stars, alternating with 4 rows of 5. Symmetry, simplicity, modern flair. He submitted his homemade flag with pride. His teacher gave him a B. The critique? It lacked originality. That's right, the design that would eventually fly over every federal building, every school, every embassy on Earth was considered unimpressive. But Heft didn't accept defeat. He wrote to Congress. He wrote to the White House. He campaigned for his design like a teenage lobbyist with thread burns. Then, miracle of miracles, his version was selected. When Hawaii officially became the 50th state in 1960, Heft's flag became the official national flag. The teacher, to his credit, revised the grade. This wasn't just a feel-good story. It was American myth-making in real time. A high school student outwitting bureaucracy. A DC design committee bested by after-school stitching. It proves that sometimes the most enduring symbols of national identity start as extra credit. And speaking of national birds and other close calls, let's head into the next absurd debate. Benjamin Franklin's campaign to crown the as America's feathered symbol of pride. The turkey that almost became a symbol. Bald eagles look majestic from a distance. Up close, they're scrappy, carrion-snatching messes with the dead-eyed stare of a velociraptor on Xanax. Benjamin Franklin knew this, and he wasn't impressed. In fact, he famously argued that the bald eagle was a bird of bad moral character and suggested a more noble candidate for America's national symbol, the turkey. Yes, the turkey. The bird modern Americans associate with gravy, overeating, and awkward family conversations. But to Franklin, it was the perfect emblem for the scrappy, self-reliant new republic. Turkeys, he said, were courageous, vigilant, and, unlike eagles, native to America. They didn't steal food like scavengers. They earned. They were honorable. Franklin's suggestion wasn't entirely a joke. In a letter to his daughter, he lamented that the eagle had been chosen instead, calling it a bird of bad moral character and a coward that does not get his living honestly. The turkey, by contrast, was a much more respectable bird. Imagine that alternate history. A turkey etched onto coins, soaring badly, across military insignia. Thanksgiving would be a surreal combination of patriotism and cannibalism. The jokes practically write themselves. But Franklin lost that battle, and the eagle won, probably because it looks more heroic. Never mind that it's a fish thief with a scream that's usually dubbed over in movies with the cry of a red-tailed hawk. Image won over ethics. America, from the very beginning, chose the pretty liar over the earnest clucker. And speaking of theatrical illusions, let's shift from noble birds to manufactured towns. Because once upon a mushroom cloud, the U.S. built an entire fake city just to see how badly it could burn. The nuclear test town that wasn't real. At the height of Cold War anxiety, the U.S. government conducted nuclear weapons tests in Nevada. And to make things even more dramatic, they built entire fake towns. That's right, full-scale American neighborhoods constructed in the middle of the desert. complete with homes, streets, furniture, mannequins, picket fences, and pantries stocked with canned peaches. Why? To test what would happen to American life in the event of a nuclear blast. Spoiler: it didn't go well for the mannequins. These doomed towns were carefully staged to mimic middle-class domestic bliss. There were kitchens with dishes in the sink, closets full of shirts, and front porches where polyester-clad dummies sat frozen in poses. Then a bomb was dropped. The houses were obliterated. Furniture turned to kindling. Fake families melted mid-meal. The government filmed everything, in slow motion, from every angle. These films weren't just scientific, they were propaganda. They were shown to soldiers, school children, and Congress, all to emphasize the sheer power of the American arsenal. "Look at what we can do," they whispered between mushroom clouds. It was both terrifying and performative, a way of testing destruction while pretending it was all in the name of safety. These weren't just nuclear experiments. They were theatrical incinerations of Americana itself. And in some of the towns, a few homes were built more sturdily than others, to which styles could survive. Because even at the end of the world, real estate marketing never sleeps. Eventually, the test moved underground. The towns were abandoned. The mannequins long vaporized. But the ghostly idea remains. We built a fake America just to prove we could blow it up. Next up, let's meet the meat packer who became the most unlikely national icon of all time. Uncle Sam, the man behind the myth, and yes, he was real. Sam was a real guy, and he smelled like meat. Long before he became the finger-pointing, top-hat-wearing, star-spangled avatar of U.S. propaganda, Uncle Sam was just a guy named Samuel Wilson, a meat packer from Troy, New York. Which means that the most enduring symbol of American patriotism originated in a barrel of salted beef. The story goes like this. During the War of 1812, Wilson supplied meat to the U.S. Army, stamping his barrels with HUS to denote government property. Soldiers, either jokingly or earnestly, started saying it stood for Uncle Sam, their affectionate nickname for the guy sending them rations. The name stuck, mutated, and eventually ballooned into a full-blown national caricature. Wilson himself was by all accounts a decent man, honest, industrious, smelled vaguely like brine. He had no political ambitions, no interest in being a symbol. He was just a contractor doing his job, feeding troops with salted meat during a war no one really remembers in detail. But the name had legs. It traveled. By the mid-19th century, Uncle Sam was appearing in political cartoons. In World War I, he evolved into the scolding, poster-perfect recruiter demanding you enlist. By then, Wilson was long dead, his real face replaced by an idealized stern white man with finger extended and judgment implied. So next time you see that iconic poster, remember, that's not just nationalism incarnate. It's a ghost made of beef. A working-class supplier who accidentally became America's uncle through bureaucratic misinterpretation and battlefield slang. And if you think that's weird, wait until you hear about the woman to run for president. Because she didn't just run, she ran in 1872, while women still couldn't vote. Victoria Woodhull, the woman who ran before she could vote. In 1872, when most American women were still legally classified somewhere between child and property, Victoria Woodhull announced her candidacy for President of the United States. That's not a misprint. Nearly 50 years before women gained the right to vote, Woodhull decided she didn't need permission. She just aimed for the Oval Office instead. She wasn't just running against the political establishment, she was body-checking the entire 19th century American patriarchy. Woodhull was a spiritualist, a suffragist, a stockbroker, and a publisher. She believed in free love, women's rights, and sticking it to puritanical. She also believed that if men were allowed to ruin the country unopposed, women should at least be able to apply for the job. Her running mate? Frederick Douglass? Yes, that Frederick Douglass. Although historical evidence suggests he may not have formally accepted the nomination, the symbolism was explosive. A woman and a black man on a ticket in 1872. This wasn't politics. It was performance art with ballots. Woodhull was, predictably, ridiculed. Her campaign was ignored by the press when it wasn't openly mocked. And just days before the election, she was arrested for publishing an obscene newspaper. Her own paper, which had dared to expose a sex scandal involving a prominent preacher. So while the country went to vote, without her or any other woman, Woodhull sat in jail. She received no electoral votes. But that wasn't the point. Her campaign wasn't about winning. It was about detonating the idea that political power had to be male. Next time you see a first woman to do X headline, remember, Victoria Woodhull got there first, barefoot, handcuffed, and carrying a torch. Now let's rewind from runs to land grabs. Specifically, the time America bought an entire continent-sized state for pocket change. Alaska, the 2-cent snowball. In 1867, the United States made one of its most absurdly lopsided real estate deals, purchasing Alaska from Russia for $7.20 million, about 2 cents an acre. At the time, critics called it Seward's Folly, named after Secretary of State William H. Seward, who brokered the deal. To most Americans, Alaska was an icebox, a frozen wasteland better suited for polar bears than profit. Russia, meanwhile, was eager to offload it. Managing that distant tundra had become a logistical nightmare, and they feared losing it to the British anyway. So they cashed out, and America bought in. The deal was signed, sealed, and executed without anyone realizing that they had just bought a future gold mine, oil field, and strategic military foothold for the price of a few lobbyist dinners. At first, there wasn't much to celebrate. No one was quite sure what to do with this frozen frontier. It was remote, sparsely populated, and seemed utterly impractical. But over time, the land revealed its buried treasures: gold, timber, fish, and eventually vast reserves of oil. What was once dismissed as a barren ice block became a cornerstone of American energy policy. The purchase was also a flex. It signaled that the United States was done playing local and ready to go global. It was expansion not by conquest, but by transaction. It proved that sometimes America wouldn't take land. It would just wait for you to give it away. And in hindsight, Seward's Folly turned out to be an absolute steal. Russia probably still regrets it. Now let's shift from cold economics to air, specifically the longest, most stubbornly tedious speech in U.S. Senate history, where one man filibustered for over 24 hours straight. Not for glory, but to fight civil rights. Strom Thurmond's 24-hour stall. If you've ever sat through a corporate meeting that felt like it might outlast time itself, then you've tasted a fraction of what Strom Thurmond inflicted on the U.S. Senate in 1957. For 24 hours and 18 minutes straight, the South Carolina senator stood and spoke against civil rights. It remains the longest filibuster in Senate history. Not a record honor, but of obstinate old-school obstructionism. Thurmond wasn't trying to delay a tax hike or filibuster a farming bill. He was fighting the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, and a baby step toward voter protection for Black Americans. And he did it the only way that allowed, by weaponizing boredom. Thurmond prepared for weeks. He dehydrated himself slowly so he wouldn't have to urinate. He had throat lozenges, newspapers, and water stashed away. He read from the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Criminal Code, and even recipes. That's right, he filled by reading recipes. Because nothing slows progress quite like a man in a suit reciting how to make pudding. The result? It didn't work. The bill passed anyway. But the symbolism was clear. Some lawmakers would rather speak into a microphone for a full day than let civil rights move forward an inch. Thurmond's filibuster wasn't just long. It was grotesque in its intent. It stands as a monument to the lengths some will go to preserve the status quo, dressed up as civic duty, drenched in the sweat of rhetorical futility. And if you thought that was absurd, wait until you hear how the most commonly used word in the English language, okay, got its start as a joke and stuck forever. Okay, the misspelling that over the world. Okay is the most recognized word on the planet. It crosses borders, languages, cultures, and keyboards. It's so ubiquitous, it practically vanishes into the background. But its origin? An inside joke based on a misspelling from the 1830s. Back then, Boston newspaper editors had a strange hobby, printing absurd abbreviations. They turned all correct into all correct and shortened it to OK as part of a trend of intentionally mangled acronyms. It was linguistic trolling with a printing press. The phrase caught on, partly because it looked punchy, and partly because it sounded like something a drunk politician would mumble at a debate. Then along came the 1840 presidential election. Martin Van Buren, the incumbent, nicknamed Old Kinderhook after his New York hometown. His supporters turned OK into a campaign slogan, short, catchy, meaningless. The opposition fired back by linking it to horrible calamity. And just like that, the joke was everywhere. Political satire met meme culture, 19th century edition. But instead of fading like other novelty slang, OK stuck. Ambiguity became its strength. It meant approval, neutrality, and efficiency. It was quick to write, easy to say, and impossible to misinterpret. Telegraph operators loved it. Typists embraced it. By the time America entered the industrial age, OK was stamped and approved on everything from contracts to crates of dynamite. So the word that now punctuates texts and confirms Uber rides was born from a typo and nurtured by political pettiness. Its rise was neither logical nor deliberate. It was pure, chaotic cultural inertia. And if that's not American, what is? Speaking of frontier absurdity, the next story explodes, literally, when the government tried taxing whiskey and got rebellion instead. The Whiskey Rebellion. Shots fired over shots. In the 1790s, the fledgling U.S. government needed money. What better way to raise funds than to tax alcohol? That was Alexander Hamilton's bright idea, a tax on distilled spirits, especially, which was basically the rural economy's unofficial currency. Cue the rage of every backwoods farmer between Pennsylvania and Kentucky. To these farmers, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was survival. They used excess grain to distill spirits, which were easier to store, transport, and sell than raw crops. The tax was seen not as a financial inconvenience, but as a direct assault on their livelihood. And unlike rich merchants or coastal elites, these folks didn't have lobbyists. They had muskets. What followed was the Whiskey Rebellion, a dramatic, armed protest where tax collectors were tarred, feathered, and sometimes outright assaulted. Government offices were attacked. U.S. Marshals were run out of town. For a moment, it looked like the revolution had rebooted. George Washington, now president, was not amused. In 1794, he personally led a militia of nearly 13,000 troops to crush the uprising, the only time a sitting U.S. president has led an army in the field. The rebellion dissolved quickly once the feds showed up in force, but the message was clear. This was not a government that would tolerate armed insubordination over booze. Still, the incident raised uneasy questions. Was this truly a republic, or just a new monarchy in different clothes? Was taxation with representation any less infuriating? The tax was eventually repealed. The rebellion faded into footnotes. But it left behind a moral. Don't come between Americans and their liquor, unless you're ready to bring an army. Now let's turn to a different kind of energy surge, one sparked by a single man who turned invention into... His name? Edison. Edison's 1,000 bright ideas. Thomas Edison is often painted as the ultimate American inventor. Brilliant, tireless, slightly villainous, and aggressively taking credit. And he didn't just tinker in a basement. He built an industrial empire out of ideas, patents, and sheer capitalist fervor. Edison held over 1,000 patents in his lifetime. Not a typo, over 1,000. He invented, or more accurately, developed and aggressively marketed, things like the phonograph, the motion picture, the electric pen, and of course, the incandescent light bulb. He didn't invent the bulb, but he improved it enough to take ownership in the public eye. Which, for Edison, was the whole point. His real genius wasn't just an invention, it was in systematizing innovation. He created the first industrial research lab where employees brainstormed, built, and beta-tested technology like it was a factory assembly line. It was corporate creativity before that was even a concept. But Edison wasn't a saint. He was a showman and a brawler. He fought viciously with like Nikola Tesla in what became known as the War of the Currents, DC versus AC. Edison electrocuted animals in public to scare people away from Tesla's alternating current. Yes, that happened. Yes, it was as grotesque as it sounds. Still, Edison's impact is undeniable. He helped define what it meant to be an American inventor. Pragmatic, relentless, self-mythologizing. He didn't just chase ideas, he marketed them, monetized them, and molded the national narrative around them. Every time a light flicks on in a dark room, some sliver of Edison's legacy hums to life, reminding us that innovation in America is rarely pure, often brutal, but always blindingly bright. Next up, we go sparking lights to soaring birds. Let's talk about when the U.S. Army used pigeons to deliver wartime messages with eerie efficiency. The Pigeon Post, warbirds with messages. In the modern world of satellites, GPS, and encrypted emails, it's hard to believe that one of the most reliable wartime communication methods used by the U.S. Army was pigeons. Not metaphorical pigeons, real ones. Feathers, coos, and tiny message capsules tied to their legs. These winged messengers were deployed extensively during World War I, flying through gunfire and gas clouds to deliver battlefield updates faster and more accurately than any human runner or telegraph line. And they weren't just useful, they were astonishing. Pigeons could return to their home lofts from hundreds of miles away, often through extreme weather and with bullets slicing the air around them. Loyalty wasn't ideological, it was instinctual. Homing pigeons don't ask questions, they just fly home. One bird, Cher Ami, became a literal war hero. Despite being shot, blinded in one eye, and losing a leg, she still delivered a critical message that saved nearly 200 trapped American soldiers. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre, stuffed, and put on display in the Smithsonian, a tiny, mangled symbol of military loyalty with wings. The U.S. Army had entire Pigeon Corps units, complete with handlers, breeding programs, and mobile lofts. During both World Wars, pigeons were standard issue, feathered comrades with the highest survival in a land full of mechanical failure. Eventually, of course, radio and radar made them obsolete. But for decades, pigeons were not vermin or punchlines. They were soldiers, decorated, trusted, missed. And while the modern battlefield hums with drones and code, there's something oddly poetic about the fact that, not so long ago, the fate of an entire battalion might have hinged on a single bird flying through hell. Speaking of symbols and secret meanings, the next tale isn't about birds, but about eyes. Specifically, the all-seeing one watching from atop the Great Seal of the United States. The pyramid in the eye. America's occult branding. If you've ever stared at a U.S. dollar bill long enough, you've probably noticed the cryptic artwork hidden in plain sight. On the reverse of the Great Seal sits a 13-step pyramid, unfinished, with an all-seeing eye hovering above it. It looks like something out of a Dan Brown fever dream, and it's sparked every conspiracy theory imaginable, from Freemasons to Illuminati to alien overlords in colonial wigs. But what does it actually mean? The pyramid represents strength and durability, with its 13 steps symbolizing the original colonies. The capstone, still floating, symbolizes an incomplete nation, forever striving toward higher ideals. That's the Eye of Providence, a divine symbol watching over the Republic, theoretically of liberty and justice. But it's unsettling, isn't it? That stare, that omniscient gaze, like a surveillance camera with religious aspirations. The Latin phrases add to the aura. Annuit coeptis translates to He, God, has favored our undertakings. Meanwhile, Novus Ordo Seclorum means a new order of the ages. It all sounds eerily like the mission statement of a secret society plotting to take over the world from an underground temple in Philadelphia. The design was chosen in 1782, long before it was onto currency. And yes, Some of the designers were Freemasons, because of course they were. But the iconography wasn't intended to signal a hidden agenda. It was meant to inspire awe, to link the divine to democracy, to wrap a fragile new country in timeless mystery and authority. And it worked. Centuries later, it still creeps people out. It still whispers power, and it still appears on every dollar like a wink from the Founding Fathers saying, "We see you." We shift from symbols of eternity to death by digestion. Let's revisit the president who gorged on cherries and milk and paid the ultimate price, Zachary Taylor and the lethal snack. Zachary Taylor was a war hero turned president, a no-nonsense general whose battlefields earned him the nickname Old Rough and Ready. But in the end, he was neither rough nor ready for what killed him. A bowl of cherries and a glass of milk. It was July 4th, 1850. Washington, D.C. was a sweltering sauna, and Taylor had just attended a lengthy Independence Day celebration. Parched and ravenous, he reportedly downed a generous helping of chilled milk and fresh cherries, both likely warm from the midday heat. Shortly after, he fell violently ill with stomach and diarrhea. Within 5 days, the president was dead. The official cause was gastroenteritis, an inflammation of the stomach and intestines likely by contaminated food or water. But given the timing and the volatile political climate surrounding slavery and the Compromise of 1850, conspiracy theories blossomed like mold on old fruit. Was Taylor poisoned? Some believed he was murdered to tilt the balance of power in the slavery debate. Decades later, his body was exhumed to test for arsenic. The results were inconclusive, but the whispers never stopped. Whether it was assassination or indigestion, the fact a sitting president died because of a snack. It's a uniquely American brand of mortality, dramatic, ironic, and oddly gastrointestinal. Taylor's death threw the nation into turmoil and elevated Millard Fillmore to the presidency, shifting the political tides at a critical moment in pre-Civil War tension. So next time you enjoy a fruit salad, raise a glass to the man who proved that even the most hardened general can be felled by bad dairy. Coming up, a dancing epidemic so absurd it sounds made up. But this American mass hysteria was too real. America's dancing plague. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, long before TikTok, flash mobs, or dance therapy, parts of early witnessed what can only be described as a choreographic crisis. Scattered communities, people spontaneously broke into dance. Not at parties, not during weddings, but in the streets, in the fields, in churches and marketplaces, flailing, spinning, jerking in fits of ecstatic, uncontrollable movement. It was called dancing mania, and no one knew what the hell was going on. The phenomenon wasn't uniquely American. It had roots in Europe, with infamous outbreaks in the Middle Ages, but early American colonies weren't spared. In tight-knit Puritan communities already burdened by fear of witches, devils, and vaguely sinful thoughts, of dozens of people dancing to the point of exhaustion, sometimes death, was more than just unsettling. It was terrifying and biblical. Victims would collapse, then rise again, moving as if possessed. Witnesses described it as a plague of joyless motion. Doctors, priests, and neighbors had no answers. Was it mass hysteria? A neurological disorder? A social panic with rhythm? Modern theories range from ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that can infect grain, to collective trauma responses. But in the moment, it felt supernatural, an invisible puppeteer forcing communities into manic performance. Authorities tried everything: prayer, isolation, music, even exorcisms. Nothing worked. The episodes would eventually fade as mysteriously as they began, leaving behind only confused survivors and a permanent question mark in the annals of early American oddities. If you think TikTok trends move fast, imagine your neighbors collapsing mid-harvest to an invisible beat, and no one sure if it's a curse or a stroke. And speaking of this world motion, let's rocket forward to a modern miracle. The first American to orbit Earth. A man who literally rode fire into the unknown. John Glenn, First Orbit, Final Frontier. On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn climbed into a capsule perched atop a missile and became the first American to orbit Earth. It wasn't just a milestone, it was a moment of significance. A human being hurled into the void wrapped in aluminum foam and a whole lot of national anxiety. Glenn's spacecraft, Friendship 7, was barely bigger than a phone booth. Inside, he had about as much room as an economy-class passenger with anger issues. He orbited the Earth 3 times, spending just under 5 hours in space. But every second was a tightrope walk between glory and disaster. This was Cold War theater at its most cinematic. The Soviets had already launched Yuri Gagarin into America. Playing catch-up was desperate to put someone, anyone, into the history books. Glenn was chosen not just for his skill, but for his PR-friendly jawline, his clean record, and his ability to speak in sound bites. And when Friendship 7 splashed down safely, Glenn was hailed as a national hero, paraded through ticker tape celebrations, and temporarily became the most admired man in America. His return was a balm for a nation uncertain about its place in the space race. Decades later, he returned to space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery at the age of 77. Because why not? Apparently, once you've seen the curve of the Earth from above, you never really recover from the perspective shift. John Glenn didn't just orbit a planet. He orbited the American psyche, reminding the country that it could dream big, launch hard, and land safe, at least sometimes. And if that sounds futuristic, wait till the 19th century reveals its unexpected villain, the house cat. The feline scare of the 1800s. You'd think America's long, paranoid history of scapegoats would skip over cats. But no. In the 19th century, the U.S. briefly flirted with a full-blown feline panic. Why? Disease, of course, particularly tuberculosis and other poorly understood illnesses, which were often blamed on the sneakiest, least cooperative house guests, the common domestic cat. The logic was as thin as a stray tabby's tail. Cats roamed freely, killed birds, dug in trash, and looked at humans with judgmental disdain. To the untrained eye of 1800s medicine, seemed like vectors' death. And so, in cities and towns across the country, people began exterminating cats, mass roundups, drownings, poisonings. Entire neighborhoods engaged in feline purges as if they were performing some civic duty. This wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a broader 19th century tradition. Blame the visible but misunderstood. Cats, being nocturnal, independent, and generally indifferent to human approval, fit the bill. They became both suspect and symbol of pestilence, moral decay, and defiance. Ironically, removing cats only made things worse. Rodent populations exploded, spreading even more disease. Cities that had declared war on their populations found themselves overrun with rats. It was nature's quiet revenge, and eventually public health officials had to reverse course. Cats were grudgingly welcomed back, this time as pest control mercenaries. In hindsight, it's absurd. America feared cats, not bombs, not banks, not systemic corruption, cats. So the next time you see one curled in a sunbeam, just know their ancestors survived an era when people tried to erase them from existence. And they did it the way cats do everything, with silent judgment and zero effort. Coming up, the president who broke the rules, shattered tradition, and rewrote the Constitution just by refusing to leave office. 4 terms, no surrender, FDR. FDR's 4-term power move. When Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for a 3rd term in 1940, the political establishment gasped. It was unthinkable. No president had ever dared break George Washington's sacred 2-term precedent. Washington didn't even write it into law. It was more like an unwritten rule, a gentleman's agreement carved into the marble of American modesty. FDR took a long look at marble and smashed it with a grin. And then he did it again. Roosevelt wasn't just re-elected in 1940. He had a 4th term in 1944, right in the middle of World War II. The rationale was simple. The country needed continuity, but the subtext was blunter. He was irreplaceable. Everyone knew it. America, terrified of both global fascism and domestic collapse, chose the devil they knew, even if that devil was increasingly frail, wheelchair-bound, clinging to life through sheer political momentum. By the time he died in office in 1945, Roosevelt had become both a symbol of national resilience and a cautionary tale of power's gravitational pull. His presidency had lasted 12 years, an entire generation's worth of decisions, crises, and New Deals. He led it through the Great Depression, World War II, and countless backroom brawls with Congress, all without ever letting go of the wheel. His 4 terms sparked a national freakout that led directly to the 22nd Amendment, which limits presidents to 2 terms. FDR's political corpse essentially rewrote the Constitution from the grave. Today, Roosevelt is remembered with statues, fireside quotes, and mixed emotions. He saved capitalism, expanded federal power, and set a new bar for executive ambition. But he also made clear that in American democracy, the only real rule is what the people let you get away with. Next up, camels. Yes, camels. Because someone in the U.S. military once looked at a desert and said, "You know what we need more of?" The Great Camel Experiment. In the 1850s, the U.S. Army faced a logistical nightmare: how to move supplies across the arid, blazing hot terrain of the Southwest. Horses wilted, mules faltered, wagons got stuck. Then someone, somewhere in the War Department, had a eureka moment by heat stroke and imperial envy: camels. Thus began the Great Camel Experiment, a government-funded initiative to import dozens of camels from the Middle East and North Africa. The idea was simple. If camels could survive the Sahara, surely they could handle Arizona. They arrived in 1856 and immediately blew everyone's minds. Camels could carry twice the load of mules. They barely needed water. They spat with precision and terrified their handlers. Soldiers dubbed them ships of the desert and marveled at their weird, rubbery feet. But despite their strengths, the camels had one fatal flaw. They were not horses. They stank. They refused to be trained like traditional pack animals. They screamed. They were aggressive. And they scared the bejesus out of every mule and horse in proximity. The cavalry, already skeptical, hated them. Still, the Army kept them around for a few years, even using them in exploratory expeditions. But by the time the Civil War broke out, the camel program was a casualty of budget cuts, changing priorities, and collective embarrassment. The remaining camels were auctioned off, escaped into the wild, or ended up in circuses. Sightings of feral camels in the American Southwest persisted for decades. Tales of ghost camels wandering the desert, the last remnants of a failed experiment in cross-species logistics. So yes, the U.S. government once bet on camels to conquer the American frontier. It didn't work, but it absolutely happened. Now, from camel caravans to nightmares, let's talk about the first film ever screened in the White House, and why that matters more than it should: The Birth of a Nation and the White House screening. In 1915, President Woodrow Wilson did a film in the White House for the first time in history. It should have been a milestone for culture, technology, and American innovation. Instead, it was The Birth of a Nation, a film so steeped in racism that it makes modern propaganda look like children's programming. Directed by D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation was a silent epic set during and after the Civil War. It pioneered cinematic techniques that would become staples of Hollywood: cross-cutting, dramatic close-ups, sweeping battle scenes. It was also a love letter to the Ku Klux Klan, painting them as heroic saviors of the South and demonizing Black Americans as violent, lascivious threats. Wilson reportedly praised the film, allegedly calling it like writing history with lightning. Whether he said those words is debated. What isn't debated is the impact. The film gave cultural legitimacy to white supremacy and directly fueled the resurgence of the Klan in the 20th century. It wasn't just watched, it was worshipped by racists, and its screening in the White House gave it horrifying gravitas. Wilson, a scholar of history, should have known better. But then, Wilson also segregated federal offices, dismissed civil rights movements, and held some of the most regressive racial views of any modern president. The fact that this was the first film shown in the seat of executive power says a lot about what America was willing to endorse, celebrate, or quietly let slide. It wasn't just a movie night. It was a political wrapped in celluloid. Next, we go underground, literally, into a time when America's gold was hidden beneath a swamp, stashed in vaults no one was meant to see. Swamp vaults and golden secrets. Long before Fort Knox became synonymous with impenetrable treasure bunkers, America's gold reserves were kept in a place far less cinematic. A vault beneath the U.S. Treasury Building, located atop a literal, that's right, millions of dollars in gold were stored in the heart of Washington, D.C., quietly resting beneath government offices, under streets that once oozed mosquito-infested muck. In the early days of the Republic, the Capitol was notoriously damp, poorly drained, and strategically chosen more for political compromise than practicality. The area around the Treasury was especially swampy, and yet, that's where the nation's wealth was hidden. Engineers did what they could, constructing strong foundations, installing ventilation systems, and maintaining constant surveillance. But the location was always one part brilliance, one accident. Why keep the gold there? Visibility, control, symbolism. The vault wasn't just a secure storage unit, it was a statement. A physical manifestation of American financial power, resting beneath marble columns and bureaucratic authority. Gold bars stacked like bricks of sovereignty. As the federal government grew more sophisticated and security conscious, reserves were relocated to more secure, less flood-prone, like Fort Knox. But for a time, the beating heart of America's monetary policy pulsed beneath soggy terrain. Today, tourists pass by the Treasury without ever knowing the alchemical absurdity below their feet, that the ground once held enough gold to destabilize entire currencies. From subterranean hoards to surface-level legends, the next myth isn't about money. It's about cowboys, outlaws, and a historical lie the movies never bothered to. The Wild West wasn't nearly as wild, or as long, as we've been told. The Wild West was brief, and not that wild. Hollywood gave us the Wild West, a lawless, dust-choked wilderness of saloons, shooters, and gunfights at high noon. But here's the truth. The Wild West era, the one cowboys, stagecoaches, and dramatic train robberies, lasted maybe 30 years. Tops. From the end of the Civil War in 1865 to roughly the early 1890s. That's it. After that, the railroad arrived. Barbed wire was strung, and the U.S. government finished its violent conquest of indigenous land. And even during those 3 decades, most towns were relatively peaceful. The average Western settlement had more laws than most citizens didn't wear cowboy hats. Guns were often banned inside town limits. And those legendary duels, they were rare and usually ended quickly, more panic than poetry. So why does the myth persist? Because America needed it to? The Wild West became national therapy, a fantasy of rugged individualism, white expansionism, and moral clarity. It was colonialism with a cowboy hat, a PR campaign for manifest destiny. The dime novel industry, followed by early Western films, cemented this mythology. It sold an image of masculinity and moral resolve just as the country was becoming urbanized, bureaucratic, and anxious. In reality, the West was brutal, boring, and bureaucratic. People worked, fought disease, dug ditches, argued over water rights. They weren't outlaws, they were municipal officials. But myth is sticky, and Americans love their myths. So the Wild West lives on, in bar decor and presidential speeches, as a symbol of who we pretend we used to be. Next, let's turn the color dial up, way up, and watch as a president makes his entrance on the newest, most magical technology of his time, color television. Eisenhower and Dwight D. Eisenhower wasn't exactly a vibrant figure. His tone was measured, his haircut military issue, his expression fixed somewhere between stern and sleepy. But in 1955, he made history by doing something no president had done before. He appeared on color television. In a single moment, the gray blur of American politics was jolted into full color. It happened during a broadcast of his Columbia University speech, marking a symbolic leap from the black and white post-war world into the glossy, saturated era of mass media. The significance wasn't in what he said, it was in how he looked. Flesh tones, navy suits, blue ties that were actually blue. Color TV was still a luxury at the time, but it represented something bigger, the beginning of the image presidency. Eisenhower, ever the military strategist, understood the power of presentation. And while he may not have had Kennedy's charisma or Reagan's screen presence, he grasped the importance of optics, literally. This wasn't just a tech upgrade, it was a cultural pivot. Politicians could no longer hide behind static photographs and fuzzy audio. Every wrinkle, every raised eyebrow, every bead of sweat became part of the message. Eisenhower's color debut paved the way for the photogenic political gladiators that followed. He may have been a man of black and white wars, but in that moment, he stepped into a world of technicolor scrutiny, and America never looked back. Coming next, a weather event with a name so ridiculous it sounds like a Saturday morning cartoon. But it wreaked real havoc on California, and it all started with a storm pipeline nicknamed the Pineapple Express. The pineapple drenches. If you're imagining a Hawaiian-themed train barreling through the Pacific with ukuleles and tropical drinks, let's clear something up. The Pineapple Express is not a vacation. It's a meteorological mugging. A genuine atmospheric river, the Pineapple Express transports moist, tropical air from the vicinity of Hawaii across the Pacific and slams it straight into the west coast of the United States, especially California. It sounds whimsical. It behaves like a wrathful ocean god with a grudge. When this warm, moisture-laden air hits the cooler air over California, it dumps enormous amounts of rain, quickly, violently, and often, without a polite heads-up. Flash floods, mudslides, and landslides are standard features. In some cases, entire towns have been paralyzed, highways submerged, and hillsides torn apart. The destruction is biblical if the Bible had a chapter titled Waterlogged Bungalows and Falling Hot Tubs. The term Pineapple Express stuck because of the Hawaiian origin of the weather pattern, though there's nothing sweet or refreshing about it. It's the kind of natural phenomenon that sounds fake, like weather invented by a screenwriter who lost a bet. But it's real and deadly. What makes it even more absurd that this over-the-top weather event gets very little fanfare. Hurricanes have names. Tornadoes get sirens. The Pineapple Express? It just shows up like an angry tourist, trashes the place, and leaves Californians to mop up and pretend it didn't happen. It's a reminder that even paradise has its price. And sometimes, that price arrives in tropical disguise with suitcase-sized clouds and the personality of a soaked jackhammer. Now let's dry off and take a small leap for a man and a giant leap for American mythology. The first moonwalk wasn't just about science. It was about image, Cold War ego, and one very careful step. Neil Armstrong walks the moon. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended the lunar module ladder and delivered a line so iconic it feels like it's been printed on every American soul since. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The words were broadcast to millions, but the step itself? Incredibly cautious. Because, fun fact, no one was 100% the moon's surface wouldn't collapse under him. Let that sink in. America spent billions of dollars building a rocket, training astronauts, and racing the Soviets to the moon, only to leave open the possibility that the first man to touch the lunar surface might sink like a cartoon character into a pile of celestial flour. But Armstrong didn't sink. He bounced. Gracefully. Carefully. Like a man walking on an alien trampoline while wearing a tin can. And in doing so, he didn't just fulfill a presidential promise. He transformed global consciousness. Humans had left Earth, touched another world, and returned, mostly, intact. It was proof of possibility. A victory for technology, propaganda, and high-stakes optimism. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Theories bloomed. Was the footage real? Was the flag waving? Was it filmed in a studio basement next to Nixon's resignation tapes? The beauty of the moon landing is that it became not just a historical event, but a cultural litmus, a symbol of both our greatest achievement and our deepest cynicism. Armstrong, for his part, never chased the spotlight. He was famously private, uneasy with fame, and more engineer than icon. But for a few surreal minutes in 1969, he became the living embodiment of human ambition. Now, from outer space to inner waste, let's plunge into a much less glamorous side of American history. The moment when horse poop almost destroyed modern civilization. The Great Horse Crisis. In the late 1800s, American cities, especially New York, were drowning in an unexpected enemy: horse manure. Before the rise of cars, urban transportation ran on horsepower, and that horsepower had digestive consequences. A single horse could produce 20 to 30 pounds of manure a day. Multiply that by thousands, and you get streets piled ankle-deep in excrement, buzzing with flies and soaking into everything. This wasn't just unsightly. It was a health hazard. The manure attracted disease-carrying insects, clogged drainage systems, and smelled like something Satan might ferment in a cellar. City officials panicked. Urban planners predicted apocalyptic scenarios. One estimate claimed that by 1950, every street would be buried 9 feet deep in horse dung. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Horse Manure Crisis. Solutions ranged from massive cleanup efforts to bizarre mechanical contraptions that, in retrospect, look like medieval torture devices repurposed for street sweeping. Nothing worked. The manure kept coming, and so did the desperation. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, salvation arrived on 4 rubber wheels: the automobile. Early cars were mocked, dangerous, and unreliable, but they didn't poop. That alone made them worth the gamble. Cities transitioned rapidly, and within 2 decades the horse had all but disappeared from urban life. It was one of history's most unexpected technological triumphs, not driven by innovation for innovation's sake, but by the need to clean the streets of steaming, smelly chaos. And yet, the crisis serves as a pungent reminder that progress isn't always about moving faster. It's sometimes about reducing fallout, literally. Next, we enter the zoology lab of early American democracy, where gerrymandering was born, not as policy, but as a hideous, mutated salamander. The salamander that rigged democracy. In 1812, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry approved a redistricting map so blatantly designed to benefit his political party that one of the districts looked like a misshapen monster. A newspaper editor took one look at the map, pointed at the most grotesquely contorted section, and said it resembled a salamander. Thus, gerrymander born. Part political insult, part accidental branding masterstroke. It should have been a one-time joke, but it caught on. Because what Gerry had done, strategically redrawing districts to consolidate power, wasn't just legal, it was effective. And because this was where any dirty trick with a cute name gets institutionalized, gerrymandering became a permanent feature of the political landscape. The practice works by slicing and dicing voting districts in bizarre ways, grouping together or separating communities to guarantee electoral outcomes. Need to dilute opposition voters? Draw a long, skinny district that snakes through just enough neighborhoods. Want to protect incumbents? Wrap a district around their base like political bubble wrap. It's democracy by topographic manipulation, and it's as American as apple pie and low voter turnout. The irony is that Elbridge Gerry himself was reportedly uncomfortable with the map, and his name lives on not for signing the Declaration of Independence, but for pioneering one of democracy's most enduring hacks. His part district, part monster has been reshaping political power ever since. So next time you see a congressional map that looks like roadkill, know that it's not a mistake, it's history. And speaking of history's experiments gone wrong, let's visit the plantations of South Carolina, where the U.S. briefly dreamed of becoming a global tea empire. America's brief love affair with tea. After winning independence from the British, Americans had a complicated relationship with tea. It was the drink of the enemy, the symbol of taxation, colonial, and a harbor-based protest. But by the 1800s, enough time had passed for pragmatism to return. Tea was profitable, and South Carolina, with its steamy, subtropical climate, looked like a potential tea-growing paradise. So began one of the strangest agricultural experiments in U.S. history, tea in Dixie. It wasn't totally unhinged. Botanists and entrepreneurs genuinely believed that American-grown tea could rival the quality of China and India. Camellia sinensis plants were imported, test gardens established, and full-blown plantations attempted. Labor was, predictably, exploitative. The science was shaky, but the ambition? Pure capitalist optimism with a caffeine kick. The reality was less inspiring. The plants struggled. Disease spread. Weather patterns didn't cooperate. Most importantly, the knowledge needed to grow and process high-quality tea was deeply specialized and very hard to replicate on the fly. American growers underestimated just how technical the entire operation was. Tea isn't just a crop, it's a craft. And while there were fleeting successes, one or two plantations even produced drinkable batches, the dream of a booming U.S. tea industry dried up like a forgotten kettle. Eventually, the fields were abandoned, and America went back to importing its tea while pretending coffee was more patriotic anyway. Today, South Carolina still has a few boutique tea farms, a quiet echo of the grand dream. But the tea empire never materialized. It turns out that the revolution might have been steeped in liberty, but not in local leaves. Next up, the first television, where the swearing in of a president became a shared national event, beamed straight into America's living rooms for the very first time. Truman Goes Primetime. In 1949, Harry S. Truman stood before the Capitol, hand raised, ready to begin his full elected term as President of the United States. It was a ceremony like many before it, orchestrated, symbolic. But this one had a new twist. It was broadcast live television. For the first time in history, Americans could sit in their homes and watch their president take the oath in real time. Politics had officially gone primetime. This was no small thing. Until then, inaugurations were local spectacles, attended by dignitaries, reported in newspapers, maybe heard on the radio. But television added a new layer of intimacy and immediacy. You didn't just read about power, you watched it happen, right there, in grainy black and white. Truman's inauguration marked a shift in the American presidency from distant office to living room fixture. From that point on, optics became inseparable from governance. How a president looked, sounded, and even paused would be scrutinized by millions, live. It was the dawn of a new kind of political theater, and Truman, for all his lack of glamour, was its reluctant pioneer. He delivered a speech that day warning of the global spread of communism and declaring a new American mission in the post-war world. But what stuck wasn't just his words. It was the medium. Television didn't just broadcast politics. It changed it. Every president after Truman would grapple with the power and peril of the screen. But he was the first to turn the presidential oath into a broadcast event, transforming democratic ritual into national spectacle. And speaking of strange methods of reaching for the skies, next up is a Cold War technology so surreal it sounds like out of a comic book. The skyhook. Yes, America really tried to lasso space. The skyhook lassoing the stratosphere. Some Cold War military ideas make you wonder if someone spiked the Pentagon's coffee. Among them, the skyhook. Not a metaphor, not a fishing story. A real, actual plan to extract people and objects from the Earth's surface using a giant balloon, a long tether, and a passing airplane moving at terminal velocity. The idea sounds like something a magician would attempt during a nervous breakdown. But the U.S. actually tried it. Known officially as the Fulton Surface-to-Air Recovery System, the skyhook was developed in the 1950s for the most niche of military needs, retrieving spies or critical equipment from behind enemy lines without landing a plane. The method? Have the person on the ground strap into a harness connected to a helium balloon. The balloon would ascend, pulling the tether skyward. A specially equipped aircraft would then fly by, snag the line with a V-shaped yoke, and reel in the passenger like a mildly terrified fish. It worked. Not comfortably, not gracefully, but it worked. People were literally yanked off the ground into the sky, mid-air, mid-mission. The system was even used in real-life situations, including one documented retrieval of a man in the Arctic. The psychological image is pure Cold War absurdity. The skyhook as a symbol of American ingenuity so desperate, so theatrical, it seemed to defy gravity and logic at once. It wasn't just about technology. It was about spectacle. The idea that if you couldn't land, you'd simply pluck your people out of enemy territory like a crane game at an arcade. Eventually, better aircraft, drones, and sophisticated rescue methods made the skyhook obsolete. But for a brief, shining moment, America's answer to "how do we get that guy?" was tie him to a balloon and wing it. Now let's dial down the altitude and celebrate a quieter milestone. The first American to win a Pulitzer Prize, and the strange fiction holds in America's self-image. Ernest Poole and the first Pulitzer. In 1918, amid the chaos of a world at war and a flu pandemic, the Pulitzer Prize Committee handed out its first award for fiction. The recipient wasn't Hemingway, or Faulkner, or Steinbeck. It was Ernest Poole, who, even in his own time, was kind of the literary equivalent of a polite handshake. His novel His Family was the inaugural winner, and today, you'd be forgiven for never having heard of it. Poole was a journalist turned novelist, writing with sincerity, social awareness, and a deep belief in the American middle class. His family told the story of a widower navigating change in New York City, a tale of generational drift and moral questions, back before those became cliches. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was grounded. And for a brand new literary prize seeking to define American letters, it checked all the boxes. The Pulitzer's choice of Poole reveals a lot about the cultural aspirations of early 20th century America. They wanted stories that were earnest, improving, and distinctly American. Fiction was not yet a playground for stylistic rebellion. It was a tool for shaping values, confirming identities, and holding up a mirror to the average man. Poole himself would fade into obscurity, outshone by the literary giants who followed. But his Pulitzer win remains a strange, poignant footnote, a reminder that prestige often lands not on the boldest voice, but the one that fits the mood of the moment. And so the Pulitzer began not with a bang or a genius, but with a careful novel about familial obligation, as American as oatmeal. Now let's turn back the clock, farther back, and look skyward again. But this time not with balloons, planes, but with hot air and spy eyes. Welcome to the Civil War, where military recon took flight in wicker baskets. The Balloon Corps takes off. During the Civil War, before drones, before radar, even before reliable maps, the Army briefly turned to the skies. And by the skies, we mean a few hundred feet up in a hot air balloon, to see what the enemy was doing. It wasn't fantasy. It was the Balloon Corps, a real branch of military intelligence whose soldiers floated above battlefields in oversized baskets, gathering intel while praying the wind didn't carry them into Confederate territory. The concept was novel. Using hydrogen-filled balloons, Union observers could ascend, get a panoramic view of the terrain, and telegraph coordinates down to generals below. It was, in a way, the birth of American aerial surveillance, though instead of satellites, had sandbags, silk envelopes, and the ever-present risk of being shot at while dangling from a gas bag. The Balloon Corps was the brainchild of Thaddeus Lowe, an eccentric inventor with a flair for the dramatic and a deep faith in elevation. Lowe even demonstrated the system by over D.C. and sending a telegraph to President Lincoln. Lincoln, to his credit, didn't laugh him out of the White House. He saw, and thus, balloon espionage got its big break. Of course, the technology had flaws. Balloons were difficult to maneuver, impossible to hide, and comically vulnerable to weather. Their military value diminished as the war evolved, and eventually the Corps was disbanded. But its brief existence paved the way for all that followed: airplanes, satellites, and the idea that high ground wasn't just tactical, it was technological destiny. So yes, America's first Air Force wasn't a fleet of jets. It was a few guys floating baskets, watching the world from above, hoping not to drift into infamy. Next, let's drop back to Earth, into the factories of World War II, where one iconic woman rolled up her sleeves and reshaped the American workforce with a rivet gun and a rolled-up sleeve. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just one woman. During World War II, while the men were overseas dodging bullets and bureaucracy, American factories faced a crisis. Who was going to build the bombs, planes, and tanks? Enter Rosie the muscular, headscarfed, and flexing into the national psyche with a single raised arm. But here's the twist. Rosie wasn't a real person. Or rather, she wasn't just one person. She was a myth built from many, a composite heroine of America's homefront industrial push. The propaganda machine needed a face, and it got one, a poster woman who symbolized patriotism and moral duty. She didn't complain. She didn't hesitate. She tightened bolts and broke stereotypes. Behind the image were countless women, millions, who entered factories, shipyards, and assembly lines, proving not just that they could do men's work, but that they could do it better, faster, and with fewer smoke breaks. The real-life inspirations for Rosie included factory workers like Naomi Parker Fraley, whose photograph inspired the iconic "We Can Do It" poster, and Roswell Monroe, a riveter who appeared in promotional films. But the symbol became larger than any one biography. Rosie was a rallying cry, an answer to war, a counterpunch to economic despair, and of course, a reminder to buy war bonds. After the war, many Rosies were expected, politely but firmly, to return to domestic life. Their jobs were reclaimed by returning soldiers. But the legacy remained. Rosie wasn't just about rivets. She was about rewriting what American women could look like, do, and demand. And while the factories fell silent, these never did. Next, we move from rivets to roosters, or rather mutant poultry, as the U.S. tried to breed a beast that could win the war on breakfast. Super chickens and the egg-laying arms race. In the 1940s and 1950s, American agriculture entered a new era, not of pastoral peace, but of ruthless optimization. With wartime rations still echoing and a booming population to feed, scientists and farmers looked to the humble chicken and asked, "How can we make you lay faster, fatter, and forever?" Thus began the super chicken experiment. It sounds like a cartoon. In reality, it was a biological arms race waged in hen houses across the country. Breeders used selective genetics to create chickens that matured quickly, converted feed into meat with terrifying efficiency, and popped out eggs like factory widgets. These birds weren't your grandfather's backyard cluckers. They were avian Frankensteins, mutant feathered machines designed for productivity, not personality. The results were astounding. Egg production soared. Chicken became the cheapest meat in America. Grocery shelves filled with protein. Mission accomplished, right? Well, sort of. The super chicken at a cost. The birds suffered from brittle bones, heart failure, and aggression. Packed into industrial coops, they pecked each other into submission. Farmers resorted to debeaking, antibiotics, and cages designed more for containment than comfort. What began as a quest for efficiency became a moral wrapped in wire mesh and feathers. The experiment worked too well, and it rewired how Americans ate forever. So the next time you scramble an egg or devour a nugget, remember, behind that protein lies a long lineage of over-engineered poultry, bred to serve a nation that preferred speed over soul. Next, let's switch from the barnyard to the... Meet James Garfield, the ambidextrous president who didn't just write with both hands. He wrote in 2 different languages. At once, James Garfield, the 2 linguist. James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, had many talents. He was a Civil War general, a preacher, a classic scholar. But perhaps his most unsettling talent was this. He could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other, simultaneously. Let's pause for a moment and let that sink in. Most of us struggle to write a legible grocery list with our dominant hand. Garfield, on the other hand, literally, could conduct a multilingual bilateral handwriting ballet. It was part parlor trick, part scholarly flex, and entirely bizarre. Who does that? Who wants to do that? Garfield was one of the most intellectually gifted presidents in U.S. history. He graduated from college as class valedictorian, taught classical languages, and rose through the political ranks with his brain as much as his record. But his twin-handed linguistic feat remains the ultimate example of presidential multitasking. It also remains useless, except at parties, or if you're trying to simultaneously write a letter and curse your enemies in ancient Greek. This quirky ability has become one of the few things anyone remembers about Garfield, whose presidency was cut tragically short by an assassin's bullet months into his term. He spent more time dying from medical malpractice than he did governing, and the country was left to wonder what kind of leader he might have been if doctors had washed their hands. Still, even in his brief time, Garfield left behind a mystery, not just of politics, but of human potential. How many other presidents could have been ambidextrous polyglots if they hadn't been distracted by wars, scandals, or really bad doctors? Coming up next, a government agency with pasta. Yes, we're going from Greek scribbles to spaghetti statistics with the infamous short-lived Spaghetti-O-Meter. The Spaghetti-O-Meter, tracking pasta like it's a national threat. At some point in the late 20th century, the United States government decided it was vitally important to track how much spaghetti Americans were eating. Not for dietary concerns, not for cultural enrichment, but as part of a broader campaign of agricultural statistics so dense, so needlessly comprehensive, it eventually earned its own absurdist footnote in bureaucratic history, the Spaghetti-O-Meter. Now, to be clear, no physical meter actually existed. There wasn't a spinning pasta dial in the basement of the USDA, but the data tracking was real. Every strand of spaghetti consumed a thread in the vast tangled fabric of American consumption metrics. Economists tracked it. Dietitians graphed it. Policy wonks whether a dip in fusilli sales might indicate a larger cultural malaise. Why spaghetti? Because pasta is a product of wheat, and wheat is one of the cornerstones of U.S. agriculture. Knowing how much pasta Americans were consuming helped regulators gauge everything from crop subsidies to food supply chains. It was, in a twisted way, a barometer of both economic health and cultural digestion. But the image stuck. The idea of a serious-faced analyst somewhere in D.C. poring over lasagna trends and angel hair projections. The Spaghetti-O-Meter became shorthand for bureaucratic overreach. Government so obsessed with numbers it couldn't see the sauce for them. Yet it also reveals something telling: the U.S. obsession with data, with knowing, counting, charting, even the most mundane behaviors. And what could be more mundane than boiling noodles? From spaghetti to settlements, we now flash back to the 17th century to meet Jamestown, America's first permanent English outpost. A place that was supposed to be paradise, but turned out to be a mosquito-infested, cannibal-flavored disaster. Jamestown, the original American horror story. In 1607, a group of English settlers arrived in what is now Virginia and established Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. They were hoping for gold, glory, and maybe a few easy diplomatic chats with the locals. What they got instead was disease, starvation, infighting, and a terrifying winter that pushed them to each other. That's not hyperbole. Archaeological digs have uncovered bones with cut marks, confirming that during the infamous starving time of 1609-1610, some settlers resorted to cannibalism. The colony, besieged by Native American resistance, bad planning, and worse hygiene, became less a beacon of civilization and more a slow-motion train wreck. They weren't prepared for anything, certainly not farming. Many were gentlemen, utterly unequipped for manual labor. Others were hired swords. They built a fort, but failed to build a functioning society. Disease swept through their ranks. Fresh water turned brackish. Mosquitoes delivered malaria like clockwork. And yet, somehow, Jamestown endured. Reinforcements arrived. Tobacco became a cash crop. And slowly, painfully, the colony stabilized. But the cost was enormous, measured in bodies, broken treaties, and the first seeds of colonial arrogance that would bloom into centuries of conflict. Jamestown wasn't America's founding fairy tale. It was its cautionary prologue, historical horror to futuristic war strategy. Next up is one of the strangest ideas ever pitched by the Pentagon: using eagles as anti-drone warriors. Because nothing says 21 Saint century like medieval bird-based warfare. Talons versus tech. America's eagles. In an era dominated by AI, facial recognition, and unmanned aerial vehicles, the U.S. briefly flirted with a defense strategy that felt like it was ripped from the pages of a medieval bestiary, using trained eagles to take down enemy drones. Yes, eagles. Giant, feathered, clawed missiles with talons. The idea wasn't born out of nostalgia. It was to real threats. Cheap, commercially available drones were being used for espionage, drug trafficking, and even attacks. They were small, fast, hard to detect, and even harder to shoot down without collateral damage. Enter the eagle, nature's apex predator of the skies. These birds were trained to spot, intercept, and disable drones mid-flight. They were incredibly accurate, could distinguish friend from foe, with some margin for error, and had no qualms about slamming into whirring plastic intruders at full speed. It was high-tech meets feathered fury. And it sort of worked. Eagles proved surprisingly adept at shredding drones out of the sky. But ethical questions, safety concerns, and the occasional bird-related casualty eventually grounded the idea. Turns out birds don't come with spare parts or warranty replacements. The program faded, like so many military oddities before it. Fascinating, half-effective, and ultimately unsustainable. But for a brief moment, America's anti-drone future looked a lot like its mythic past. An eagle soaring into battle, claws out, defending the homeland. It was poetic, ridiculous, and deeply, deeply American. Coming up, from feathered fighters to feline pioneers, we meet the president who owned the nation's very first Siamese cat. Because of course he did. Rutherford B. Hayes and the first Siamese cat in America. Of all the things one might associate with Rutherford B. Hayes, the beard, the contested election, the fact that most Americans couldn't pick him out of a lineup, the first Siamese cat in the United States probably isn't one of them. But it should be. In 1878, the 19th president received an exotic feline from the American consul in Bangkok, and it became the toast of the White House. The cat's name was Siam. Elegant, slender, with piercing blue eyes and the regal aura of something that knows it descended from temple gods, Siam quickly became a sensation. The Hayes children adored her. Visitors were both intrigued and mildly unsettled. After all, this was a time when Americans were still getting used to indoor plumbing, let alone cats that looked like miniature panthers crossed with ghosts. Siam prowled the White House halls with aristocratic disdain, occasionally appearing in correspondence and press reports like a surreal footnote in a presidency otherwise defined by post-Reconstruction malaise and rail strikes. But her presence mattered. She was a symbol, a diplomatic curiosity, and an early sign of America's evolving relationship with pets. Not as utility animals, but as companions with personality, style, and in Siam's case, geopolitical backstory. Sadly, Siam died before Hayes left office. The president reportedly asked that she be preserved, taxidermied like a small purring relic of cross-continental diplomacy. How that happened remains a mystery. Today, Hayes is remembered barely, but Siam deserves a statue. She was the beginning of a long, sometimes ridiculous love affair between U.S. presidents and their photogenic pets. From fur to fireless tobacco, next we journey into the haze of government innovation, the bizarre tale of America's attempt to invent the smokeless cigarette. The smokeless cigarette that nobody asked for. The idea behind the smokeless cigarette was simple. Eliminate the smoke, and you eliminate the stigma. In the mid-20th century, with mounting evidence that smoking caused cancer, the U.S. government and private companies alike flirted with the notion of a safer cigarette. Not a nicotine patch, not gum, a cigarette that could still deliver that familiar hit, minus the carcinogenic cloud. So they tried. What emerged was a Frankenstein's monster of tobacco innovation. A cigarette that didn't burn but heated, releasing nicotine-laced vapor without combustion. It sounds eerily similar to today's e-cigarettes and vape pens, but the early versions were disasters. The prototypes were clunky, had the subtlety of a welding torch, and often tasted like you were licking a melted battery. The biggest issue? Smokers didn't like them. They were supposed to be a bridge between addiction and abstinence, but they felt like punishment. No smoke, no scent, no ceremony, just hot air and disappointment. Many were recalled, shelved, or quietly disappeared into the archives of innovation purgatory. But the smokeless cigarette is a strange relic of America's weird history of trying to eat its vice cake and not choke on it. The logic wasn't let's stop smoking. It was let's smoke without consequences. A logic so American it should come printed on currency. The real punchline? Decades later, vaping returned. Slicker, cooler, and wrapped in fruity branding. But the roots go back to this failed experiment. A glimpse of a future where we still wanted our habits, just not the judgment. Now let's shift from puffing indoors to camping outside. In the makeshift cities of the Great Depression, where the American dream pitched its tent and named it Hooverville. Welcome to Hooverville, America's 10th rebellion. During the Great Depression, as banks collapsed and jobs evaporated faster than a politician's promises, thousands of Americans found themselves homeless. With no safety net, no resources, and no prospects, they did what desperate people have always done. They improvised. Across the country, shanty towns sprouted up like weeds. People built shelters from wood scraps, tin sheets, and cardboard. They called these communities Hoovervilles in honor, or rather in condemnation, of President Herbert Hoover. Hoover, seen as aloof and ineffective, became the reluctant mascot for a nation in crisis. People blamed him for the economic collapse, and in return, they gave his name to every symbol of their suffering. Shantytowns, Hoovervilles, empty pockets turned inside out, Hoover flags, newspaper blankets, Hoover blankets. These makeshift communities were both tragic and defiant. They represented the failure of the system, but also the resilience of the people. They had mayors, rules, social dynamics. Some even had libraries and rudimentary schools. But they were also havens for disease, violence, despair. Authorities often tried to evict residents, burn down shelters, and erase the visual reminder of national failure. But Hoovervilles kept returning, because poverty doesn't vanish with a bulldozer. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office, he inherited not just a broken economy, but a landscape dotted with these settlements, living, breathing protests against economic abandonment. Hoovervilles are long gone, but the name sticks in the cultural memory, a reminder that when a government fails its people, it will build their own society from the rubble. Crude, vulnerable, and hauntingly American. Next up, not in shanty towns, but an entire famine. Not in Ireland, but right here in the U.S., where a blight brought agricultural America to its knees. The Great Potato Famine, American edition. When most people hear the words potato famine, they instinctively think of 19th century Ireland. The fields gone black, the ships with desperate emigrants, the grim poetry of starvation. But few realize that the United States had its own potato crisis. It wasn't as apocalyptic, but it was real, painful, and revealing. In the 1840s, the same blight that devastated Irish crops, the infamous Phytophthora infestans fungus, crossed the Atlantic and started infecting American soil. The U.S., already flooded with Irish immigrants fleeing famine, found itself confronting the same diseased tubers and agricultural panic. In places like New York, Pennsylvania, and New England, potatoes blackened in the ground. Farmers watched their staple crop turn to mush, and markets began to panic. Though the scale of suffering in America wasn't on par with Europe's devastation, the emotional resonance was sharp. The blight threatened not just food, but livelihoods, especially among poorer communities and immigrants who depended heavily on cheap caloric produce. The American government responded with research rather than relief, launching one of the earliest coordinated scientific responses to agricultural crisis. Scientists scrambled to understand the fungus, publishing bulletins and recommending crop rotation, lime treatments, and new storage methods. It was the beginning of the modern agricultural extension system, a silver lining rooted in rot. The blight's impact also intensified xenophobia, as Irish immigrants were scapegoated for both the disease and the competition for scarce jobs and resources. And yet, potatoes remained, bruised but unbroken, as a dietary cornerstone. The American stomach, it turns out, has a short memory. Now, let's leave the fields and return to the funeral parlor. Specifically, the one where Andrew Jackson's parrot had to be evicted for profanity, because no one curses quite like a bird. Andrew Jackson's swearing parrot. Andrew Jackson was a man of contradictions, hero and butcher, populist and tyrant, reformer and scourge. So it makes sense that his pet would also be a walking contradiction, or rather a squawking one. Jackson's parrot, named Paul, was infamous for its vocabulary of obscenities, a skill set reportedly honed by listening to Old Hickory, which frankly tracks. Paul became an odd fixture in Jackson's later life. The bird had a sharp tongue and a keen sense of timing, traits that made it more than just a pet. It was a living caricature of its owner. Jackson swore like a cannonade, and Paul followed suit, absorbing curses with the diligence of a courtroom stenographer. But the legend crystallized at Jackson's funeral in 1845. As the mourners gathered in reverence at the Hermitage, Paul reportedly began squawking profanities so lurid and loud that the clergy had to remove from the ceremony. Imagine the scene: a room full of dignitaries, war veterans, and statesmen, all trying to pay, while a parrot lets loose a barrage of 19th century obscenities that could make a sailor blush. Some accounts describe guests gasping, others laughing. Either way, it was a fitting farewell for a man who lived and ruled without a filter. Paul became folklore, an avian avatar of Jackson's fiery legacy, a pet so scandalous it disrupted a funeral. And honestly, it might be the most honest political eulogy in American history. Now, from feathered profanity to flying saucers, not the alien kind, but the U.S. military's own attempt to build one. Yes, Project 1794 was real. It was funded, and it was exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. Project 1794, America's flying saucer. During the Cold War, the U.S. military wasn't just racing the Soviets in nuclear arms and spaceflight, it was also trying to out-weird them. Enter Project 1794, an Air Force-backed initiative to build a real-life flying saucer. Not metaphorically, not artistically. Literally a disc-shaped aircraft that looked like it had crash-landed from the day Earth stood still. The project, led by Avro Canada under U.S. funding, was supposed to produce a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that could hover, zip around at Mach 3, and deliver payloads, people, across battlefields without runways. It was part helicopter, part jet, part fever dream. On paper, it sounded like science fiction. In practice, it's like a trash can lid wobbling over a heat vent. Engineers tried. They really did. They built prototypes. They tested different propulsion systems. They even managed to get one saucer to hover a few feet off the ground for brief, unstable moments. But the design had fatal flaws. It was incredibly hard to control, couldn't fly very high, and had the grace of a pancake being flipped by a nervous short-order cook. After millions in funding and several years of head-scratching, Project 1794 was quietly shelved. The dream, a disc-shaped death machine, had fizzled. But the documents weren't classified forever, and when they were finally declassified decades later, they revealed just how far the U.S. was willing to go in its quest for futuristic superiority. Project 1794 remains a shining symbol of Cold War absurdity, a moment when the military-industrial complex hit UFO hysteria and said, "You know what? Let's try it too." Coming up next, from fictional spacecraft to very real female, we meet the first American woman to launch herself into space and into history. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. In 1983, the Shuttle Challenger launched from Cape Canaveral carrying a payload of scientific equipment, a team of astronauts, and one woman who would change history. Sally Ride wasn't just breaking the sound barrier. She was breaking every gender expectation baked into the bones of American aerospace. At 32 years old, she became the first American woman to travel into space, shattering an interstellar glass ceiling with the quiet force of a rocket. NASA hadn't always been in a rush to include women. In fact, it resisted the idea for decades, citing everything from physiological nonsense to deeply rooted sexism masked as scientific concern. But Ride, a physicist with a dry wit and steel nerves, bulldozed past the bureaucracy with intellect and restraint. When asked whether spaceflight might affect her reproductive organs, she offered a smile that could cut metal. When questioned about her makeup kit, she deadpanned, "Does NASA think I'll be putting on in zero gravity?" Her flight lasted 6 days, but its cultural shockwave is still echoing. She handled robotic arms, operated satellite payloads, and did it all with the calm poise of someone who knew every reporter was watching for her to... She didn't. She orbited. Ride never made herself the story, but the story clung to her anyway. After NASA, she turned to education and advocacy, founding organizations to inspire young women in science. She kept her private, only publicly acknowledged after her death in 2012, when it was revealed she had been in a 27-year relationship with another woman. In that quiet disclosure, she became an icon all over again. From stars to stagecoaches, we now descend into a darker corner of American history, where outlaws boarded locomotives not for speed, but for cash. The Great Train Robbery of 1866. The Great Train Robbery of 1866. Before Butch Cassidy ever dreamed of blowing up a rail car, there was the Reno Gang. In 1866, these charming sociopaths orchestrated what would become America's first peacetime train robbery, setting a precedent for every Western cliché to come. No movie-style explosions, no twirling mustaches, just precision theft, frontier desperation, and a total lack of subtlety. The target was an Ohio and Mississippi Railway train departing from Indiana. The gang, made up of Civil War who had learned the art of violence and the science of disillusionment, boarded the train, cracked open a safe, and made off with an estimated $13,000, a king's ransom at the time. They vanished into the night, and the country woke up to a new kind of criminal celebrity. Train robberies weren't just about theft. They were about spectacle. The railroads were America's veins, pumping wealth, people, and promise from coast to coast. To rob a train was to interrupt the heartbeat of manifest destiny. It was vandalism with symbolism. The Reno Gang didn't stop at one hit. They went on a spree, more trains, banks, and even local treasuries. But fame has a price, and their downfall came just as theatrically. A vigilante mob captured several members and lynched them in cold blood. The law, it seems, wasn't fast enough for frontier justice. Still, the Reno Gang's legacy endured. They became the blueprint for the American outlaw myth, rebels without a cause, riding the rails, sticking it to the man. Their story is still retold in half folklore, where bandits are charming and crime is just mischief on horseback. Now let's pause the gunpowder fantasies and shift to something deceptively dull, yet existentially intense. The national motto of the United States and the quiet war of meaning behind 4 little words. In God we trust, faith, fear, and irony. In God we trust. You see it on every dollar bill, etched into coins, carved into marble, even displayed in courtrooms. It's America's national motto, adopted officially in 1956, and meant to project spiritual backbone. But behind its pious simplicity lies a cold war of symbols, paranoia, and the odd habit of turning theological catchphrases into government slogans. The phrase didn't spring from the founders. In fact, many of them would have rolled their Enlightenment eyes at the idea of divine branding. The original national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, was secular, unifying, and inclusive. But in the 1950s, as the Red Scare gripped the nation, anything that smelled even faintly of atheism was treated like treason. So Congress, in a surge of religious rebranding, slapped "In God We" onto the national identity. It was strategic moralism. Communists were, and America needed to make it clear we were godlier. The phrase began appearing on currency, replacing previous mottos, subtly rewriting what patriotism was supposed to look and pray like. But the irony is thick. For a country with a First Amendment guaranteeing religious freedom, adopting a theistic motto felt like a theological advertisement. Critics argued it blurred the line between church and state, while supporters claimed it was harmless tradition. That debate hasn't gone away. Court cases, protests, and petitions still flare up over those four words, carved into stone, but never quite settled in spirit. "In God We Trust" is less a statement of belief than a historical artifact, an anxiety-fueled reaction to global politics that masquerades moral consensus. It's a motto born not in revival, but in fear. And next, we swap prayer for pest control, entering the absurd annals of World War II, where bats weren't just symbols of horror movies. They were literal bomb carriers. Yes, bomb bats. That happened. Bat bombs. World War II's strangest. If you thought the war effort peaked with tanks and aircraft carriers, allow us to introduce you to what is perhaps the most absurd military idea ever seriously funded by the United States: bat bombs. That's right, explosive-carrying bats deployed as living munitions. The idea was so insane it could only come from the American imagination at war, fueled by fear, ingenuity, and apparently a complete lack of ethical sleep. The concept was simple in that deranged World War II kind of way. Strap tiny incendiary devices to Mexican free-tailed bats, load them into bombs, drop the bomb casing from a plane, and have it open mid-air, releasing the bats. These nocturnal pyros would then roost in buildings across Japanese cities, especially the highly flammable wooden ones. Their timers would go off, igniting countless tiny fires simultaneously. The result? Chaos, destruction, and hopefully victory. And for a while, it looked like it might actually work. The bats were successfully trained. The miniature functioned. One test at a U.S. airbase accidentally released armed bats too early, setting the testing facility ablaze and proving, ironically, that the plan worked. Just on the enemy. Ultimately, the Bat Bomb project was canceled in favor of a little thing called the atomic bomb, because compared to nuclear fire, incendiary rodents suddenly seemed quaint. But the Bat Bomb lives on in military lore as the ultimate of lunacy and logistics. A reminder that, in war, no idea is too strange if it might give you the edge. And speaking of presidential eccentricities, our next stop involves morning swims, national rivers, and a president who decided clothing was optional. Yes, it's time to talk about John Quincy Adams' birthday suit. John Quincy Adams went skinny dipping. In an age before social media scandals and leaked footage, John Quincy Adams was already setting presidential records for boldness, eccentricity, and a willingness to show a bit too much commitment to his morning routine. Every day at dawn, the sixth president of the United States would wade into the Potomac River. Not in swim trunks, not in a bathing costume, completely naked. Adams believed in vigorous health practices. He walked miles daily, recorded every meal, and took to cold water swims like a monk embracing suffering. This was no leisurely float. It was a Spartan, nearly spiritual cleansing that took place without guards, protocol, and without clothing. The President of the United States alone, vulnerable, bobbing along in a public river. What could go wrong? As it turns out, quite a bit. The most famous tale, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, involves a female reporter named Anne Royal who, after being denied interviews repeatedly, tracked Adams to his morning swim and sat on his clothes until he agreed to speak with her. Whether or not the story is true hardly matters. The symbolism, perfect. A naked president, trapped by a determined woman with a pen. It's practically American folklore. Adams was fiercely intellectual, prickly, and deeply moralistic. His presidency was forgettable, but his post-presidency as a staunch anti-slavery congressman was anything but. Still, for all the mental image that lingers is not of his speeches or votes, but of a man, up to his neck in muddy water, trying to outswim the burdens of leadership. Now, from bearskin to bear, let's explore a moment when the United States stood at the crossroads of measurement and chose stubbornness over sense. It's time to talk about the metric system that almost was. America almost went metric. The United States is one of only 3 countries in the world that still clings to the imperial measurement system. Inches, feet, miles, pounds, arbitrary, inconsistent, but stubbornly American. And yet there was a moment, a real and well-documented moment, when the U.S. came incredibly close to switching to the metric system. It was the 1970s, and the government, drunk on some polyester, decided to take the plunge. Congress passed the Metric Conversion Act, which declared metric the preferred system of weights and measures for trade and commerce. Road signs were prepped, textbooks were updated, conversion charts were printed by the ton. A metric board was formed to ease and convince the public that kilometers weren't communist. But then, nothing. Americans collectively shrugged. Some school children learned metric in class, but continued pouring gallons of milk at home. Industries grumbled about costs. Politicians started backpedaling. And when Ronald Reagan took office in the 1980s, he disbanded the metric board entirely, effectively mothballing the like an expensive gym membership no one used. The irony? Most American scientists, doctors, and manufacturers already use metric every day. It's more precise, more scalable, and, let's be honest, less absurd than trying to remember how many tablespoons are in a cup. Yet, public-facing America remains defiantly imperial, as if changing systems would somehow betray the Founding Fathers. We measure progress in feet, but our refusal to go metric is a national exercise in standing still. Next, let's tilt our gaze to the skies again, not for missiles or men, but for an unidentified flying object that kicked off decades of paranoia, popcorn, and poor-quality photographs. It's time to meet Arnold and the flying saucers. The first recorded UFO sighting in the U.S. on June 24, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, a seasoned pilot and respectable businessman, took to the skies in his Call Air A-2 plane over the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. He was searching for a downed military aircraft. What he found instead, at least what he claimed to see, was something that would launch an entire genre of American paranoia. 9 gleaming disc-like objects flying in formation at impossible speeds. Arnold described them as moving like saucers skipping on water, and just like that, the term flying saucer was born. Ironically, Arnold never said they looked like saucers, only that their motion resembled one. But the media latched onto the phrase, and within days, saucers were spinning across headlines, mines, and national airspace. The Air Force, caught off guard, scrambled for explanations. Weather phenomena, misidentified birds, experimental aircraft, hysteria, but the toothpaste was out of the tube. In post-war America, already steeped in anxiety, atomic, and a sense that science fiction might not be fiction at all, Arnold's sighting was the match that lit the skies on fire. What followed was a cascade of reports, sightings, and official investigations, including the infamous Project Blue Book. For every unexplained phenomenon, there were 10 government denials. For every blurry photograph, there was a blurry excuse. And always hovering above it all was the idea that maybe, just maybe, we weren't alone, and that our government knew more than it was saying. Kenneth Arnold didn't intend to start a movement, but in describing something he couldn't explain, he helped America articulate something deeper. The fear that we weren't the biggest fish in the cosmic pond, and the thrill that we might not be the only ones watching. From the skies to science fiction, we now turn to something even more insane than aliens, a very real military attempt to build a death ray. No, really. The death ray that almost was. Long before Star Wars was a twinkle in George Lucas's eye, the U.S. military was tinkering with the idea of building its very own ray. In the 1930s, yes, the 1930s, scientists and defense officials flirted with the notion of harnessing electromagnetic energy to vaporize targets at a distance. And this wasn't just one crackpot with a coil in his garage. This was officially funded, explored, and taken just seriously enough to be terrifying. The basic concept? Concentrated beams of energy, light, or particles that could disable vehicles, explode aircraft, or incinerate enemies from afar. Science fiction was dripping into science policy. The military wanted a weapon that required no ammunition, had instant impact, and instant awe. They wanted to harness lightning and turn it into commandable vengeance. The technology, however, wasn't quite there. Prototypes fizzled. Range was poor. Precision was laughable. Instead of incinerating enemy fleets, early tests barely singed metal plates from a few feet away. But the allure remained. The death ray was a dream of power, of instant dominance, of never having to reload. While the official program lost steam before World War II, it seeded a long-standing fascination with directed energy weapons. Decades later, it would re-emerge as part of the Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars, under President Reagan. Lasers, satellites, and orbital doom became the new playground of old dreams. So while the 1930s death ray never made it past the lab bench, it never really died. It simply evolved, disguised in better acronyms and sleeker funding proposals. From fantastical future weapons to all-too-real historical bloodshed, we now land back on Earth in the violent fields of 1850s Kansas, a place that promised settlement and delivered slaughter. Welcome to Bloody Kansas. Bloody Kansas, prelude to a civil war. In the mid-1850s, Kansas wasn't yet a state. It was a battleground, not metaphorically, but literally. What was supposed to be a quiet exercise in democratic self-determination exploded one of the most brutal, chaotic, and morally revealing episodes in American pre-Civil War history. They called it Bleeding Kansas. The soil lived up to the name. At the heart of it was a question that would soon consume the entire nation. Would Kansas enter the Union as a free state or a slave state? Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the answer was supposed to come from the settlers themselves. Popular sovereignty, they called it. But in practice, it was a national invitation to rig the future by flooding the territory with your side's supporters. Abolitionists and pro-slavery settlers raced into Kansas like it was a gold rush with moral stakes, and then they started killing each other. Armed militias formed. Homes were burned. Newspapers were bombed. Ministers were shot. John Brown, the man who would later try to spark a national slave uprising, emerged here with a sword and a holy vendetta, leading a nighttime raid that left 5 pro-slavery men hacked to death in their tents. This wasn't just tension. This was open war. The federal government largely sat on its hands, paralyzed by its own contradictions. Meanwhile, Kansas bled and bled and bled. By the time it was admitted as a free state in 1861, the damage was done. Bloody Kansas was no longer a regional dispute. It was a prophecy, a testing ground for the war to come, a place where the facade of compromise collapsed in a spray of gunpowder and ideology. And if you think that was bizarre, wait until you hear how the U.S. tried to fight World War II with pigeons, not carrying messages, guiding bombs. Project Pigeon, the war's weirdest guidance system. When the U.S. military asked scientists to devise better ways to guide bombs during World War II, the usual gyroscopes, radar, human pilots just weren't cutting it. So naturally, one of America's most brilliant psychologists proposed something totally rational. Let's use pigeons. No, seriously. Project Pigeon, brainchild of behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner, aimed to turn ordinary into precision-guided missile operators. Skinner had already made a name for himself training animals using operant conditioning, and he believed that pigeons, with their sharp vision and reliable behavior under pressure, could be taught to peck at a screen displaying an image of a target. That pecking would then be translated into flight adjustments for a bomb. The setup was complex. The pigeons were housed inside a specially built nose cone of a missile, with a lens projecting the target onto a small screen. The bird pecked to keep the image centered, and then responded accordingly, adjusting the bomb's flight path. Skinner trained them diligently, and to his credit, the birds got good at it. The military, however, didn't share Skinner's enthusiasm. Despite successful demonstrations, officials were squeamish about relying on birds for wartime precision. Project Pigeon was shelved, reactivated as Project Orkan in the Cold War, and then permanently canceled. What remained was the legacy, a blend of genius and absurdity. It was a reminder that in war, desperation breeds creativity, and sometimes too much creativity. Skinner's pigeons were casualties not of combat, but of credibility. The Hindenburg disaster, when giants fell from on May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg, an enormous German airship stretching over 800 feet long, drifted into Lakehurst, New Jersey, carrying 97 passengers and crew. It was supposed to be a triumph of engineering, a majestic transatlantic arrival. Instead, it became a fiery icon of hubris and hydrogen, collapsing in just 34 seconds and searing itself into the American psyche. The airship was filled with hydrogen, a gas known to be highly flammable. Helium was safer, but restricted by U.S. export laws at the time. So the Hindenburg floated on explosive optimism. It cruised elegantly across the Atlantic, its silver skin gleaming like a floating promise of the future. Then came the storm, the static, the spark. No one's quite sure, and the instant inferno that followed. The disaster killed 36 people and obliterated public trust in dirigibles almost overnight. But what made the Hindenburg unforgettable wasn't just the tragedy, it was the coverage. Newsreel cameras captured the explosion in real time. Radio reporter Herbert Morrison's emotional commentary, "Oh, the humanity," etched the moment into cultural memory with an agony rarely heard in that era's broadcasts. In retrospect, the Hindenburg was doomed by its own ambition. It tried to blend grace and danger, aesthetics and chemistry. It succeeded only in becoming the Titanic of skies, a cautionary tale told in Smoke and Steel. Today, it lives on in photos, films, and conspiracy theories, an airborne monument to everything that can go wrong when technology flies too close to its own hype. Next, we descend from flaming wreckage into a world of stamps. Because, of course, America once issued stamps that glowed in the dark. Because if you can't lick your way into novelty, what are we even doing here? The glowing stamp, America's nighttime philately. Postage stamps are usually the last place you'd expect to find innovation. They're tiny, adhesive relics of a pre-digital world, meant to be practical, forgettable, and mildly aesthetic. So in 1993, when the United States Postal Service unveiled a postage stamp that glowed in the dark, people were rightfully baffled. Not only did it feel like overkill, it felt like someone in the design department had been reading too many Goosebumps books. The stamp was part of a celebrating Halloween, one of the first U.S. stamps to embrace the holiday in all its spooky commercial glory. It featured a jack-o'-lantern under a full moon, and when exposed to light, it absorbed energy to glow later in the dark. Think novelty toy, but for your utility bill envelope. On the surface, it was just a gimmick, but deeper down, it said a lot about the Postal Service's mid-90s existential crisis. Facing declining mail volume and growing competition from private carriers, USPS began experimenting with ways to stay relevant and generate buzz. If that meant turning into party tricks, so be it. Collectors loved it. Traditionalists scoffed. Children thought it was the coolest thing to ever happen to mail. The glow-in-the-dark stamp became a small symbol of America's tendency to over-engineer even the most mundane pieces of infrastructure. Practical? No. Necessary? Definitely not. But memorable? Absolutely. It was a flare shot into the dark, literally and figuratively, from a federal agency trying to say, hey, we still matter. Now, from the phosphorescent to the phantasmagoric, we transitioned to a military brainstorm that turned into a crab-walking nightmare. Because next, we meet the short-lived, forgotten, and deeply unsettling project: land crabs as minefield clearers. The crabby plan to clear minefields. Of all the creatures to consider recruiting into military service, giant land crabs have to be near the bottom of the list. Unless you're the U.S. government in a particularly experimental phase. During one of America's more obscure flirtations with weaponized biology, someone seriously proposed using these armored arthropods to clear minefields. Yes, really. The thinking was simultaneously bizarre and disturbingly logical. Land crabs are low to the ground, heavily armored by nature, and, importantly, disposable. The idea was to send hordes of them scuttling across suspected minefields, triggering hidden explosives with their weight, and thereby paving a path for human troops. It was, in effect, a suicide squad made entirely of shellfish. There were problems. First, land crabs don't follow orders. They unpredictably, sideways, often in the wrong direction. Second, they aren't heavy enough to consistently trigger mines. And third, convincing the public that their tax dollars were being spent turning crustaceans into unwitting martyrs didn't go over well with anyone. Ethical questions followed close behind. Was it humane to use living animals for explosive detonation? Was it even effective? Were conducted. Predictably, chaos ensued. The project was shelved before it even got a catchy name, though Operation Clawback has a nice ring in retrospect. The land crab experiment remains one of the oddest footnotes in military history. A flash of unconventional thinking that veered straight into absurdity and stayed there. From crabs to credibility, our next chapter lands us in the modern age, where symbolism, progress, and history collided in the election of a single man, Barack Obama. America's first black president, everything that followed. Barack Obama, a historic first, a nation divided. In 2008, the United States did something that, for most of its history, seemed politically and culturally impossible. It elected a black man as president. Barack Hussein Obama, Harvard Law graduate, organizer, senator, rose from relative obscurity to become the 44th president of the United States. And in doing so, he redefined not just the presidency, but the country's understanding of itself. The symbolism was seismic. A nation born in slavery, scarred by Jim Crow, and haunted by systemic racism, placed its highest office in the hands of a man who, mere decades, might have been denied a seat at a lunch counter. The celebration was electric. The backlash was immediate. Presidency was a paradox from day one. To some, he was hope incarnate, a calm, cerebral leader who spoke in poetry and governed in prose. To others, he was a symbol of everything they feared was changing: demographics, power structures, cultural norms. He faced relentless obstruction, birther conspiracies, and thinly veiled racism, even as he navigated the wreckage of the Great Recession and orchestrated the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. And yet, through it all, he remained composed. Too composed, critics argued. His legacy, Obamacare, diplomatic normalization with Cuba, the Iran nuclear deal, is as debated as his identity. Was he a transformational figure or a centrist who tried too hard to please everyone? But make no mistake, Barack Obama's presidency wasn't just a historical milestone. It was a mirror. It reflected what America had become and what it still refused to confront. Now let's take a sharply ironic turn. From the symbolism of statehood to its possible reversal, we now examine a nearly forgotten proposition: the idea that the U.S. might have given Hawaii back. Giving Hawaii back, the statehood hangover. In 1898, the United States annexed the Hawaiian Islands in a maneuver that was, let's say, ethically unclean. The U.S. had backed a coup against Queen Liliuokalani, the last sovereign monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii. in what amounted to a business-friendly regime change. American sugar barons didn't just plant crops, they planted a flag. 5 decades later, Hawaii, the 50th state, symbolically closing the loop on a conquest dressed up as a handshake. But here's the strange twist. Not long after statehood, some voices in American politics began to wonder, should we give it back? In the wake of rising decolonization movements across the globe and a growing understanding of indigenous rights, the annexation of Hawaii began to look less like manifest destiny and more like colonial theft. A fringe idea emerged: return sovereignty to native Hawaiians. This wasn't a joke. There were internal government memos, activist petitions, and serious academic debates. The notion never made it to the floor of Congress. But the very fact it was considered, more than once, speaks volumes about America's occasional brief flashes of historical guilt. Ultimately, the idea was shelved like a bad inheritance. There was too much military infrastructure, too many tourists, too much investment to reverse course. You can't destate a state, after all. And yet, the issue lingers. Native Hawaiian sovereignty groups still exist. The scars of annexation are still raw, and the state still wrestles with the question, can you be a democracy if your very borders were drawn by coercion? Next, we travel back to economic philosophy, specifically a time when America measured its worth in actual gold, a heavy, glittering, rigid system known as the gold standard. Welcome to the era where wealth had literal weight, the gold standard, where money had mass. Before America's dollars floated on faith and fiscal policy, they floated, quite literally, on gold. The gold standard was the backbone of U.S. economic policy for decades, a glittering promise that every dollar was backed a fixed quantity of gold. The logic was elegant. Tie currency to a scarce, shiny metal, and you prevent inflation, corruption, and government monkey business. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty, it turns out. But at first, it worked. The gold standard gave confidence to international markets, restricted reckless spending, and made sound money a political mantra. It also made recessions harder to fix. Because when your economy tanks and you're shackled to metal bricks in a vault, options are limited. Still, gold was seductive. It had history. It had weight. It looked good on paper and better in Fort Knox. Americans believed in gold not just as money, but as morality. Gold was honest. Paper was not. But the cracks appeared early. During crises, gold-backed currency systems struggled to respond. The Great Depression laid bare the system's rigid flaws. By 1933, Roosevelt took the U.S. off the gold standard for domestic transactions. Internationally, it limped along until 1971, when Nixon finally cut the golden umbilical cord entirely. Since then, the dollar has floated free, anchored by trust, markets, and vibes. Gold bugs still grumble, dreaming of the days when money jingled and glittered. But the modern economy runs on confidence, not coins. Next, we plunge from metallic nostalgia to scientific lunacy, as the U.S. once tried to turn monkeys into maids. Yes, we're about to enter the banana-scented chaos of simian domestic training. Prepare yourself. Teaching monkeys to do. There's a fine line between genius and madness, and somewhere right in the middle sits the American plan to teach monkeys how to do housework. It sounds like the setup to a slapstick cartoon, but for a brief moment in the 20th century, researchers, institutions, and a few overly optimistic households believed primates could be as tiny furry butlers. Capuchin monkeys, with their dexterous fingers and relatively high intelligence, were the species of choice. That was simple and completely deranged. If they can learn tricks at the zoo, why not laundry at home? Monkeys were taught to turn lights, fetch objects, and in some cases load dishwashers. One even learned to use a remote control, because of course it did. But the problems were immediate. Monkeys are not domesticated. They're strong, moody, and mischievous. They don't take orders. They don't work well unsupervised. And most importantly, they have no concept of clean. One monkey reportedly tried to wash dishes by licking them. Another learned to turn a vacuum, but then used it to chase the cat. Ethical concerns weren't far behind. Is it humane to chain a wild animal to the tedium of human chores? Is a monkey mopping the floor really helping? Or just a furry prisoner in a suburban zoo? Ultimately, the idea fell out of favor. The experiment was quietly abandoned, though echoes of it live on in service animal programs that, with great care and training, use capuchins to assist individuals with mobility impairments. But those are regulated, compassionate efforts, glorified monkey maids. From banana peels to bricklaying, our next story is about the construction of the White House. Specifically, how workers were compensated with something both intoxicating and historically on brand: whiskey. Whiskey wages, building the White House on booze. In the late 18th century, while Europe was slicing through aristocracy with guillotines and Napoleon was busy conquering half the continent, the United States was building the most symbolic structure, the White House. It was a project meant to house presidents, project power, and establish permanence. But underneath the stately columns and neoclassical facade lies a lesser-known truth. It was built, in part, with whiskey. That's not a metaphor. The laborers, many of whom were enslaved Africans, indentured servants, and underpaid immigrants, were actually paid in whiskey. Daily. It wasn't just a bonus or a holiday perk. It was built into the compensation system. You laid bricks, you got a shot. You hauled stone, you're poor. If you survived a week of back-breaking, sun-drenched construction without keeling over, congratulations, you earned a government-sponsored buzz. At the time, whiskey wasn't just recreational. It was medicine, morale booster, and currency rolled into one. Clean water wasn't always reliable and were often doled out erratically. Whiskey, on the other hand, was consistent. Liquid incentive, a socially sanctioned anesthesia for the kind of labor no one wanted to remember sober. But this historical fun fact comes with a bitter chaser. The White House, symbol of democracy and freedom, was quite literally built on exploitation, addiction, and systemic inequality. Enslaved men cut timber, laid bricks, and carved stone, while being paid in nothing but liquor and forced labor. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their work remains. So next time someone calls it the People's House, remember which people they're talking about, and which ones were too drunk, too broken, or too invisible to ever walk through the front door. And with that, we close our journey through 101 of the most ridiculous facts in U.S. history. A nation that conquered continents, split atoms, and taught pigeons to pilot bombs, all while making sure its White House was built with a steady pour.